In the years after the Civil War, the United States was a country in motion. Railroads pressed farther across the land, factories multiplied, telegraph wires stitched distant places together, and the language of progress entered ordinary conversation. The old rhythms of rural life still remained in many towns and farms, but they now existed beside a new confidence in machines, industry, and invention. It was in this changing America, half rooted in the 19th century and half leaning toward the modern age, that the lives of Wilbur and Orville Wright began. Their story would later seem to belong to the sky, but its first foundations were laid in parlors, workshops, church households, and the quiet habits of thought formed in childhood. Wilbur Wright was born on April 16, 1867, near Millville, Indiana, not in Dayton itself, though Dayton would become the true center of his life. 4 years later, on August 19, 1871, Orville Wright was born in Dayton, Ohio. They were sons of Milton Wright and Susan Kerner Wright, and they grew up in a family that was intellectually serious without being rigid, disciplined without being narrow, and unusually rich in the kinds of encouragement that matter most in early life. Their household was not wealthy, and it was touched, as many families were, by grief and uncertainty. Of the 7 Wright children, 5 survived infancy. Yet within the home, there was a durable sense that the world was something to be studied, handled, questioned, and understood. Their father, Milton Wright, was a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ. A man of conviction, travel, and formidable intellect, his duties meant that the family moved at different times through Indiana, Iowa, and Ohio, and the children grew up with some awareness that life was larger than any single town. Milton was deeply engaged with ideas and argument. He read widely, wrote forcefully, and kept a substantial household library. Books were not ornamental in the Wright home. They were used. They were discussed. They were there to be opened by curious hands. From Milton, the children inherited not simply a respect for learning, but a habit of independent judgment. He did not train them to accept every claim that came dressed in authority. He trained them, more quietly, to think for themselves. Their mother, Susan Kerner Wright, gave the household another kind of influence, equally important and perhaps even more unusual for the time. She had studied literature and science, and she possessed strong mathematical ability. In adult life, she became known within the family as a woman who could make things with her own hands, devising household appliances and constructing toys for her children. This practical intelligence left a lasting impression on Wilbur and Orville. In Susan, they saw that thought did not have to remain abstract. A problem could be examined, a solution imagined, and then the solution could be built. The line between intellect and craftsmanship was thin in her example. Years later, when the brothers approached mechanical questions with patience and confidence, they were drawing from a domestic world in which tools, materials, and ingenuity had already been made familiar. The Wright household was therefore shaped by 2 strong currents at once: an inward life of reading and reflection, and an outward life of making and repair. For children of alert minds, this combination was especially fertile. Wilbur and Orville were not pushed toward a single profession, or made into copies of their father. Their education came partly through school, but just as importantly through atmosphere. They learned to read, but they also learned to notice. They learned that a machine was not a mystery to be admired from a distance. It was a thing composed of parts, and parts could be studied. They learned that questions were not signs of disobedience. They were the beginning of understanding. Such lessons are hard to measure, but they shape a life as surely as formal instruction does. Because Milton's church work carried the family from place to place, the children did not grow up within a single, unbroken local routine. There were schools in different states, new neighborhoods, and shifting circles of acquaintance. Yet Dayton gradually became the enduring center of the family's identity. It was there that the brothers would later work, experiment, and make history. But even in childhood, the city offered something important. Dayton, in the late 19th century, was not a metropolis, yet it stood within the expanding industrial life of the Midwest. Workshops, small manufacturers, rail connections, newspapers, and commercial energy all formed part of its atmosphere. It was a place where practical enterprise seemed natural, where a mechanically minded young person could observe both the ordinary tools of daily work and the larger forces transforming American society. Wilbur, the elder brother, was remembered as serious, self-contained, and intellectually intense. He had a disciplined mind and, from an early age, a kind of inward steadiness that could appear almost severe. Yet this reserve was not coldness, it was concentration. Those who knew him later often remarked on the force of his thought and the precision of his language. As a boy and young man, he seemed marked for higher formal education. He was bright, capable, and by many accounts expected to continue on toward college. There was about him an impression of promise that others easily noticed. He read widely, reasoned carefully, and possessed the kind of mental rigor that might have led naturally into scholarship or public life. Orville, by contrast, had a somewhat different temperament. He was lively, inventive, and drawn toward the practical expression of ideas, where Wilbur's intelligence often appeared in the form of sustained mental discipline. Orville's showed itself through experiment, contrivance, and a restless delight in making things work. He was not less intelligent, but differently so. He had a gift for the concrete problem, the device on the table, the mechanism that could be improved. In school, he did not follow the most conventional path to completion, but this says little about his real powers. Like many inventive minds, he was educated as much by self-direction as by formal curriculum. He absorbed knowledge selectively, guided by interest, and what interested him he pursued with unusual energy. Together, the brothers formed a partnership whose importance can seem obvious only in hindsight. In childhood, it existed not as destiny, but as habit. They lived in the same atmosphere, learned from the same parents, and developed under the same broad influences. Yet each supplied something the other needed. Wilbur brought analytical depth, patience, and a capacity for sustained theoretical thought. Orville brought mechanical fluency, cheerful resourcefulness, and an instinct for construction. The bond between them was strengthened further by the character of family life. The Wright children were close, and their sister Catherine, in later years especially, would become an essential emotional and practical support within the household. But even before the world knew their names, Wilbur and Orville had already begun, almost unconsciously, to form the durable collaboration on which their future work would depend. One of the most remembered moments from their childhood came in 1878, when Milton Wright returned from one of his trips and brought home a small toy helicopter for his sons. It was based on an earlier design principle associated with French aeronautical experiments and was powered by twisted rubber bands that spun its rotors. The toy flew only briefly, but its effect lingered. Wilbur and Orville were fascinated by it. They did not merely enjoy it as a novelty. They studied it, played with it, and when it broke, they tried to build versions of their own. In later recollections, this modest object became one of the symbolic beginnings of their interest in flight. It did not by itself create their future, but it offered an early union of wonder and mechanism. Something rose into the air, not by magic, but by design. That distinction mattered. Such childhood fascinations take root only under certain conditions. Many children encounter a toy and forget it. What made the difference in the Wright household was the permission to continue thinking about it. Curiosity was not hurried away. There was room for lingering over a question. There was room, too, for failure. A broken toy could become an invitation rather than a disappointment. This capacity to remain with a problem, to return to it, to test one idea and then another, would later define the brothers' approach to aeronautics. But it began in a domestic setting, long before wind tunnels and gliders, in the simpler experience of seeing that the physical world responded to patient inquiry. The broader world around them reinforced the sense that invention was a natural human activity. Post-war America celebrated mechanical ingenuity. Newspapers carried accounts of new devices, improved manufacturing methods, and engineering feats that seemed to announce a fresh age. The telephone, electric light, improved printing technology, and the expanding railroad network all formed part of the mental background of the era. Even for families not directly involved in industry, technology had become part of the national imagination. The Wright brothers were born into a culture increasingly convinced that stubborn problems could be solved by careful minds and capable hands. They would later apply this belief to flight, but in childhood, they first absorbed it as part of the age itself. Yet the shaping of a life is never the result of inspiration alone. It is also altered by interruption, disappointment, and the slow redirection of plans. For Wilbur, one of the decisive turning points came in the winter of 1885 to 1886, when he suffered a serious injury in what is generally described as a hockey accident. Before that, he'd been on a path that seemed likely to lead toward college. Afterward, his course changed. The injury and the long period of recovery that followed removed him from the expected trajectory of formal advancement. It also appears to have drawn him into a more withdrawn and reflective period of life. Rather than moving outward into the ordinary ambitions of a promising young man, Wilbur spent crucial years at home, reading, thinking, and caring in part for his ailing mother, whose health declined before her death in 1889. The future narrowed in one sense and deepened in another. It would be too simple to say that this injury made Wilbur the man he became, yet it undeniably altered the rhythm of his development. Adversity often strips away one imagined future and leaves behind a more difficult freedom. Wilbur's hopes for college faded, but in their place came long periods of self-education and inward discipline. He became, in effect, a scholar outside the institution. The habits of close reading, rigorous thought, and emotional restraint that later colleagues would recognize in him were strengthened during these years. A life that might have moved into conventional professional channels instead turned back toward the household, and, eventually, toward the practical partnership with his younger brother. History often remembers breakthroughs, but quieter reversals are just as important. They change not only what a person does, but how he thinks. Orville's formation in these same years followed a different course, but remained closely intertwined with Wilbur's. He showed increasing interest in making, tinkering, and independent enterprise. The confidence to build things from parts, to improvise, and to trust one's own workmanship did not emerge suddenly in adulthood. It was already visible in youth. He belonged to a generation coming of age in an America where small-scale entrepreneurship was possible, and where a mechanically adept young man could imagine not only working for others, but starting something himself. The habits that would later lead him into printing and then bicycles were foreshadowed in the self-directed curiosity of his early years. By the middle of the 1880s then, the essential elements of the brothers' early intellectual world were already in place. There was the father's library and habit of argument. There was the mother's mathematical intelligence and practical craftsmanship. There was the atmosphere of a nation enthralled by invention. There was a home in which curiosity was not merely tolerated, but nourished. There was the memory of a toy that lifted itself into the air, leaving behind an image greater than its size. And there were two brothers, different in temperament, but increasingly complementary, each acquiring without fully knowing it the exact qualities the other lacked. No one could yet have seen the machine they would one day build on the sands of North Carolina, but the deeper preparation for that moment had already begun. Quietly and almost invisibly, many years before, outside their home, the dream of human flight still belonged more to speculation than to achievement. Balloons had risen into the air for generations, but controlled, sustained flight in a heavier-than-air machine remained unsolved. By the later 19th century, scattered experimenters in Europe and America were testing ideas about wings, lift, propulsion, and control, though much remained uncertain and many claims exceeded what evidence could support. The brothers did not yet enter this field as active participants during the years of childhood described here, but they were growing up in an age when such questions had begun to gather new seriousness. The old dream was slowly becoming a technical problem. That shift, from fantasy to engineering, would prove essential. When Wilbur and Orville later turned toward aviation, they would do so not as romantics chasing a myth, but as practical men trained by their upbringing to believe that even the most ancient human longing might yield to careful experiment. What remains most striking about these early years is their quietness. There was no dramatic prophecy, no single revelation that announced the future. Instead, there was accumulation. Books on shelves, tools in hand, toys taken apart, questions asked seriously, setbacks endured, and minds slowly trained to unite imagination with method. The Wright brothers' achievement would later appear as one of the great turning points in technological history, but its roots were domestic and gradual. Their origins lay not only in America's changing industrial age, but in a family culture that made disciplined curiosity feel natural. By 1885, they were still simply Wilbur and Orville, sons in a thoughtful household in the American Midwest. Yet already, beneath the ordinary surfaces of youth, the habits were forming that would allow them to confront one of the oldest and most difficult ambitions in human history. The sky was still far away, but the cast of mind that would meet it had already begun to take shape. By the later 1880s, the shape of the brothers' early character had already become visible, but their future was still far from settled. Wilbur had been diverted from the formal path many expected for him, and Orville was beginning to show more openly the restless, independent energy that would mark his adult life. What joined them now was not yet aviation, but work. Before they turned their minds to the problem of flight, they learned how to run a business, how to build with precision, how to solve practical difficulties under financial constraint, and how to trust a partnership formed, not by sentiment alone, but by repeated proof. The years from 1886 to 1896 were not a mere prelude to fame. They were the workshop in which the habits behind their later achievement were patiently made. Orville, still very young, was the first to move decisively into enterprise. Even as a teenager, he had been drawn to printing, an industry that sat at the meeting point of mechanics, communication, and self-direction. Printing was both intellectual and physical. It required the arrangement of words, but it also demanded a feel for presses, ink, type, spacing, timing, and order. A newspaper did not appear by inspiration alone. It had to be composed, set, inked, and pulled into existence sheet by sheet. For someone of Orville's temperament, this kind of work held special appeal. It allowed him to build a business around skill rather than inherited advantage, and it allowed him to unite curiosity with machinery in a form the public would actually pay for. Around 1886, he was already experimenting in small ways with printing, and by 1889 he had begun publishing the weekly West Side News in Dayton. This first printing venture was modest, as such ventures usually are, but it carried the marks of Orville's developing character. He did not wait for ideal circumstances. He worked with what he had, learned what he did not know, and improved the apparatus as he went. One of the most revealing details from these years is that he built his own printing press with Wilbur's help, adapting and assembling parts rather than relying entirely on purchased equipment. This was more than thrift, though thrift certainly mattered. It reflected a deeper instinct. If a necessary machine did not exist in the right form or at the right price, one might make it. That assumption would later prove decisive in aviation. But here in the print shop, it was still grounded in ordinary commercial necessity. Wilbur joined Orville in the printing business after the first issues of the West Side News, and the partnership quickly found its rhythm. Orville remained closely associated with the mechanical and production side, while Wilbur's gifts naturally extended into editorial work, organization, and judgment. The newspaper itself served the west side of Dayton and mixed local items, clipped material, commentary, and advertisements. It was not a grand journal of national importance, but that was precisely the point. It was practical, local, and real. It had customers, deadlines, and costs. It asked the brothers to meet the world as it was, not as they might have imagined it. The work trained them in discipline. Each printed page demanded exactness. Errors multiplied if one worked carelessly. A business could fail from inattention to detail as readily as from lack of talent. The paper ran for 13 months, and afterward the brothers shifted to a daily publication called The Evening Item. That attempt was brief, and like many youthful enterprises, it did not settle into permanent success. Yet the value of the experience did not depend on longevity. Through printing, Wilbur and Orville learned how to collaborate under pressure. They learned how to divide labor without rivalry. They learned how to weigh quality against cost and speed against accuracy. Most importantly, they learned that technical skill could be turned into independent livelihood. They did not need a patron, a university chair, or an industrial magnate behind them. They could make their own instruments, define their own problems, and sustain their own experiments through business activity. That pattern, established in the print shop, would remain with them. These were also years of quiet maturity for Wilbur. The injury that had interrupted his earlier path had not made him passive. Rather, it turned him inward and gave his intellect a more severe and disciplined cast. In the printing business, he found work suited to his strengths. He could apply thought to concrete tasks. He could refine language, manage process, and bring order to an undertaking that required constancy. He was not a dreamer detached from practical life. The coming decade would show that clearly. Long before he studied the equations of lift or wrote to the Smithsonian for aeronautical material, he had already become a man accustomed to working steadily, reading closely, and approaching problems without theatrical impatience. The printing trade did not merely occupy him. It restored momentum to a life once diverted and gave him a place beside his brother, in a partnership that was becoming central to both of them. The wider setting in which this took place mattered as well. The late 19th century was an age in which print still held enormous power. Newspapers multiplied in American towns and cities, and printing remained one of the essential trades of public life. To enter that world, even on a small local scale, was to step into the modern current of information and commerce. Dayton, growing as a manufacturing and commercial center, offered the brothers both market and example. Everywhere there were signs that enterprise belonged not only to large firms, but to energetic individuals willing to master a craft. Small workshops, repair trades, and specialized businesses flourished alongside larger industrial growth. For young men with technical aptitude and limited capital, this environment encouraged initiative. The Wright brothers were not outsiders to the economic life of their time. They were products of it, and they learned to move within it with increasing confidence. Then, in the early 1890s, another opportunity appeared, one even better suited to their gifts. Across America and Europe, bicycles were becoming a social phenomenon. What had once been a novelty developed into a craze. Improvements in frame design, pneumatic tires, chain drives, and manufacturing methods made bicycles more practical, more accessible, and more desirable. They represented speed, freedom, and modernity. For city workers, professionals, and young people especially, the bicycle offered a new kind of personal motion. Streets filled with riders, shops open to sell, rent, and repair machines. By the middle of the decade, bicycle manufacturing and trade had become an energetic branch of industrial life, with thousands of businesses involved in the American market. For Wilbur and Orville, bicycles were more than a commercial trend. They were mechanical systems of remarkable subtlety. A bicycle looks simple until one studies what it asks of machine and rider together. It must be light enough to move efficiently, strong enough to bear strain, responsive enough to steer cleanly, and balanced enough to remain controllable in motion. Its performance depends not only on parts, but on relationships among parts: wheel alignment, frame geometry, chain tension, bearings, weight distribution, steering sensitivity. To repair bicycles well meant more than replacing broken pieces. It required understanding stability, control, friction, and the behavior of a moving system guided by a human body. The brothers would later say, in effect, that the experience of riding and repairing bicycles helped shape their thinking about flight. The connection was not superficial. Both machines asked the same deep question: how does one maintain balance and control in motion? In December 1892, the brothers rented a storefront in Dayton and prepared to open a bicycle business as the season approached. The new venture, first known as the Wright Cycle Exchange, placed them in a market that was expanding quickly and rewarded both craftsmanship and good judgment. At first they sold bicycles, rented them, offered parts and accessories, and repaired machines for local customers. This work demanded practical competence from the first day. A rider whose bicycle failed expected the problem fixed, not discussed. The brothers gained a reputation for reliability because they approached even ordinary repairs with seriousness. A loose chain, a warped rim, a misaligned fork, or a poor bearing was not beneath their notice. Every defect was a problem to be understood at its source. The bicycle shop also revealed the brothers at their best as collaborators. By now their temperaments had settled into a highly effective balance. Wilbur brought severe concentration, method, and a capacity to think through underlying principles. Orville brought practical ingenuity, ease with apparatus, and a kind of quiet boldness in trying solutions. Neither needed to dominate the other. That may be one of the most unusual and important facts about their story. Many famous partnerships are weakened by vanity or competition. The Wright brothers were strengthened by mutual respect. Each recognized the other's ability and adjusted accordingly. In the bicycle years, before fame could distort the relationship, This mutual confidence became habitual. It was built through shared labor, repeated small decisions, and the steady proof that they thought better together than alone. As the business grew, they moved through several Dayton locations and gradually shifted from simple repair and sales toward more ambitious work. By 1895, they were operating from the building that would become the most famous of their pre-aviation years, and they increasingly turned toward manufacturing bicycles of their own design. By May 1896, Wright bicycles were ready for sale, including models such as the Van Cleve, named for an ancestor of the family. This was a significant step. Repairing existing machines teaches one kind of skill. Designing and producing a machine to bear one's own name teaches another. It demands confidence in engineering judgment, materials, tolerances, assembly, and customer expectation. The brothers were no longer merely servicing technology created by others. They were producing finished machines themselves. In the shop, they worked with tubing, joints, sprockets, spokes, chains, and precision tools. They learned how to make parts fit, not in theory, but in metal. They learned what small inefficiencies do over time, how strain reveals weakness, and how success often depends on details so minor that careless observers never notice them. This was exactly the kind of education that later made their aeronautical work so different from the efforts of many contemporaries. When they came to flying machines, they did not approach them as spectacular inventions first and mechanical systems second. They approached them as devices whose performance would depend on exact relationships among forces, materials, and control surfaces. The bicycle shop trained their hands, but it also trained their standards. There was also a moral quality to the work. Running a small business in the 1890s meant living close to risk. Income depended on customers. Inventory cost money. Errors could not be hidden behind layers of management. The brothers became accustomed to self-reliance and careful economy. They had to measure ambition against what they could actually support. This habit of financial caution later shaped the way they pursued aviation. Unlike some experimenters backed by institutions, government interest, or wealthy sponsors, the Wrights largely financed their early flying work through the proceeds of their own shop. The bicycle business therefore gave them not only technical preparation but independence. It allowed them to advance slowly, privately, and according to their own standards rather than someone else's schedule. By the mid-1890s, another change was occurring. Still faint, but increasingly important. The brothers were becoming more aware of the unresolved question of human flight. They had not yet committed themselves fully to the problem, but the subject was moving closer to the center of their thought. Accounts of gliding experiments abroad, especially those of the German pioneer Otto Lilienthal, circulated in newspapers and magazines. Lilienthal was not merely theorizing. He was building gliders and flying them. Between 1891 and 1896, he made numerous gliding flights and became the most significant aeronautical experimenter of the period between Sir George Cayley and the Wright brothers. His example mattered because it made flight appear less like fantasy and more like a technical frontier waiting for patient minds. The brothers followed such developments with growing interest. Their attention was sharpened in 1896 by two events often cited together: the death of Lilienthal in a gliding accident and the highly publicized experiments of Samuel Langley with powered models. Lilienthal's death was tragic, but it also had an unsettling intellectual force. Here was a man who had gone farther than most and had paid for it with his life. For the Wright brothers, as they later suggested, the lesson was not that flight was impossible. It was that the problem had not yet been solved correctly. Lilienthal had demonstrated that humans could indeed glide through the air, but he had also shown how unforgiving inadequate control could be. Langley, meanwhile, represented another side of the question: power and public scientific prestige. Together, these events made aviation seem at once more urgent and more unfinished. At this stage, however, the brothers remained mechanics and businessmen first. That is what makes these years so important. Their minds did not leap from childhood fascination directly into aeronautical breakthrough. They passed through a long apprenticeship in ordinary work, and ordinary work was exactly what prepared them. In printing, they learned precision, process, and the conversion of skill into enterprise. In bicycles, they learned balance, lightweight construction, control, and the practical demands of design. In business, they learned economy, patience, and self-trust. By the time aviation began to claim them more fully, they had already built the intellectual equipment needed to approach it differently from many others. They were neither pure theorists nor reckless tinkerers. They were disciplined mechanics with a habit of reading and a partnership tested by years of labor. There is something quietly fitting in the order of these developments. Before attempting to conquer the air, the Wright brothers learned to master ink and wheels. Both trades were grounded, literal, and exacting. Both required them to serve practical realities rather than dreams alone. Yet within each trade, there was already a larger pattern. Printing dealt with communication across distance. Bicycles dealt with motion under control. The one gave them independence of mind and means. The other gave them insight into movement, stability, and the relation between human judgment and machine response. What they lacked still was a single focus to gather these lessons together. That focus would soon arrive. By 1896, the first outlines of their future were beginning to show. The bicycle shop was thriving. Their technical competence was deepening, and the old dream of flight was no longer a distant curiosity. It was becoming, slowly and irresistibly, a question they felt bound to answer. By 1896, the brothers had already built for themselves a life of steady work, disciplined thought, and practical independence. Their bicycle business was giving them income and sharpening their technical judgment. Their partnership had matured into something unusually balanced and strong. Yet beneath the daily routine of repairs, sales, and manufacture, another subject had begun to claim more of their attention. It was still not the center of their lives, but it was no longer distant either. Human flight, which had once hovered at the edge of childhood curiosity, was now entering their minds as a real and difficult problem. The transition was gradual, but it was decisive. In these few years, between 1896 and 1899, the Wright brothers moved from interest to inquiry, and from inquiry to the first serious experiments that would begin their path into aviation. One event stood at the threshold of this change more clearly than any other: the death of Otto Lilienthal in August 1896. Lilienthal, the German glider experimenter, had become the best-known pioneer of heavier-than-air flight in the world. He had made thousands of gliding flights, and had done something immensely important for anyone thinking seriously about aviation. He had shown that flight was not purely imaginary. A human being could leave the ground in a winged machine and move through the air under some degree of control. His death after a gliding accident did not diminish the importance of what he had proved. For Wilbur and Orville, it appears to have had the opposite effect. Wilbur later recalled that his interest in flying was awakened by a newspaper account of Lilienthal's fatal fall. The tragedy did not drive him away from the subject. It drew him toward it, as though the unfinished nature of the work itself had become more visible in that moment. There was something deeply characteristic in this response. Another man might have taken Lilienthal's death as a warning that the dream of flight was too dangerous or too uncertain to pursue. The Wright brothers saw instead that the problem had not yet been solved at its most essential point. Lilienthal had demonstrated courage and remarkable persistence, but courage alone was not enough. His work suggested that human flight would require not merely stronger wings or more power, but a more reliable understanding of control. The air was not like the ground. It would not forgive approximation. A flying machine could not merely rise. It had to remain governable after it had risen. This insight did not come to the brothers all at once, but Lilienthal's career and death pressed the question upon them with unusual force. The late 1890s were filled with aeronautical speculation, but much of it was uncertain, scattered, or incomplete. Around the world, inventors, engineers, and enthusiasts proposed flying machines of many kinds. Some pursued gliders, some focused on propulsion, some on balloon-like craft, and some on ideas that never moved beyond sketches or hopeful claims. What the field lacked was not imagination. It lacked agreement, dependable data, and a proven method. Even basic questions about air pressure, lift, drag, and wing form remained entangled in conflicting assumptions. It was possible to read widely on aviation and still find no clear path forward. For precisely that reason, the subject appealed to minds like those of Wilbur and Orville. It was a field where no authority had yet settled the matter, where patient experiment might still matter more than reputation. Wilbur was the first to turn this interest into deliberate study. In May 1899, he wrote to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, asking for available literature on aeronautics. It was a modest act on the surface, Yet it marked the true beginning of the brothers' scientific engagement with flight. They were no longer merely reading stray articles or following public accounts. They were assembling a body of knowledge. The Smithsonian responded with a list of works, and from there the brothers began studying the leading names in the field, including Otto Lilienthal, Octave Chanute, Samuel Langley, and others whose writings shaped the aeronautical discussions of the age. They approached these materials not as disciples searching for a master, but as mechanics and thinkers trying to locate the exact point at which previous work had stalled. This stage of reading mattered immensely because it taught them two lessons at once. First, it showed them that a long tradition of thought on flight already existed and should not be ignored. The brothers did not begin by assuming they could invent everything from the beginning. They respected prior work and studied it carefully. Second, the literature also showed them that no one had yet solved the problem completely. Different experimenters had advanced one part of the question while leaving another unresolved. Lilienthal had advanced gliding. Langley had advanced powered models. Chanute had helped gather and compare knowledge from many investigators, but the essential unity of sustained, controlled, practical flight remained beyond reach. The Wrights were learning where the frontier truly was. The insight that emerged from this reading was perhaps the most important intellectual turning point of their entire story. Many experimenters were occupied chiefly with power, as though the principal difficulty of flight were simply getting a machine into the air. The brothers increasingly came to believe that this was not the heart of the matter. Lift and propulsion were serious issues, certainly, but they appeared to be solvable in time. The deeper challenge was control. A flying machine had to be directed in the air with precision and responsiveness. It had to recover from disturbance. It had to be balanced in motion. In this respect, the bicycle shop had prepared them better than any formal scientific institution might have done. A bicycle remains upright not because it is inherently stable in every circumstance, but because a rider makes constant corrections. The brothers began to think that an aircraft would require something similar, not passive stability alone, but active control by the pilot. This was a quiet but radical departure from much conventional thinking. Many in the field hoped to design a machine so inherently stable that it would largely care for itself. The Wright brothers distrusted that approach. They believed the pilot had to be given real command over the machine, just as a rider commands a bicycle. The machine should not resist human guidance in the name of safety. It should respond intelligently to it. Here, their mechanical experience and intellectual temperament came together with unusual force. They were not looking for a dramatic leap into the unknown. They were looking for a controllable system. That emphasis would distinguish them from nearly all their major contemporaries and would become the key to their success. Once the problem was framed in this way, they began searching for a specific method of lateral control, the control of roll from side to side. Birds became one source of observation. Wilbur watched the way they adjusted their wings in the wind, altering shape and angle rather than relying on fixed rigidity. Another source was humbler and more characteristic of the brothers' way of thinking. The Library of Congress notes the traditional account that Wilbur, while idly twisting an empty bicycle inner tube box, noticed how a structure could be distorted so that one side twisted in one direction while the other side moved oppositely. Out of this came the idea that wings themselves might be warped to change the balance of forces across a flying surface. If one wingtip could be made to present a different angle to the air than the other, one side would lift more and the other less, causing the craft to roll. The principle was simple to describe and extraordinarily important in consequence. Wing warping was not yet a complete flight system, but it was the first distinctly original contribution the brothers made to aeronautics. It reflected their habit of finding a practical mechanism for an abstract problem. They were not content with saying that balance mattered. They wanted a means by which balance could be controlled at will. The elegance of the idea lay in its flexibility. Instead of treating the wings as fixed surfaces, they treated them as adjustable ones. The machine would not be a rigid object passively enduring the air. It would be an active structure capable of response. This line of thought moved them beyond admiration for earlier pioneers and into genuine invention. In the summer of 1899, they built a small biplane kite to test the concept. It had a wingspan of about 5 feet and incorporated the wing warping principle through wires that allowed the operator to twist the wings in opposite directions. The kite was modest in scale, but it represented something much larger than itself. This was the moment when the brothers' involvement in aviation ceased to be purely literary or theoretical. they had entered the stage of experiment. They were now taking an idea from paper and observation into the air, however briefly and on however small a model. The Smithsonian and National Park Service both described this kite as the brothers' first experimental aircraft, and in a meaningful sense, it was exactly that. The test confirmed that wing warping could work. By manipulating the control lines, they were able to make the kite respond in ways that suggested real lateral control. It could climb, dip, and roll under guidance rather than drift entirely at the mercy of the wind. The success did not solve every problem. It did not answer questions of full-scale gliding performance, lift data, or powered propulsion, but it validated the brothers' central intuition. Controlled flight would depend on an integrated control system, and roll control could be achieved by warping the wings. This gave them not only encouragement, but direction. They were no longer pursuing flight in the abstract. They had identified a concrete avenue for progress. There is something revealing in the scale and sequence of this experiment. The brothers did not begin with a grand machine. They began with a kite. They reduced the question to manageable size, tested a principle, observed the result, and only then prepared to proceed further. This method would define their work from beginning to end. They broke large problems into smaller ones. They preferred evidence to assertion. They did not trust elegant theories that had not met the wind. In this, they were acting less like romantic inventors and more like experimental engineers. Even before they possessed the refined data that would later come from their wind tunnel work, the discipline was already there. Their reading also helped them understand the limits of existing aeronautical knowledge. Lilienthal's published tables and experiments were valuable, and the brothers treated them seriously. Chanut's writings offered summaries of global progress and failure. Langley's work demonstrated that powered models could fly. But the brothers were beginning to sense that accepted data might not always be accurate enough for full success. At this stage, they had not yet disproved anyone's coefficients or built a wind tunnel. But the seed of later skepticism had been planted. They respected the literature, yet they also retained the independent habit taught in childhood and sharpened in business. Test what can be tested, and do not assume that authority has finished the matter. What makes these years so compelling is the way seriousness gathers almost quietly around them. There was no public declaration, no formal entrance into a scientific institution, no dramatic announcement that they intended to solve the problem of flight. They remained bicycle manufacturers in Dayton. Customers still came and went. Repairs still had to be made. Accounts still had to be kept. Yet within the routine of ordinary life, a major intellectual commitment was forming. Even their first steps into aviation bore the marks of privacy, modesty, and concentration. They did not seek immediate applause. They sought understanding. In a field crowded with ambition and speculation, that restraint gave them an unusual advantage. By the end of 1899, the essential shift had occurred. The Wright brothers were no longer men who happened to be interested in flight. They had become investigators. They had studied the best available literature, isolated the central problem as they saw it, proposed an original solution to one part of that problem, and successfully tested it in miniature. The dream of flight had taken on structure. It was now something that could be pursued through method, not merely admired through imagination. Their next step would be to leave the scale of the kite and move into gliding experiments, where the wind would test their ideas with greater severity. But before they reached the dunes of North Carolina, the real beginning had already happened in Dayton, in books opened with care, in conversations between two brothers, in observations of birds, in the twist of an empty box, and in the taut lines of a small kite answering human hands. That is how the dream of flight truly took shape for Wilbur and Orville Wright. Not as a sudden vision, but as a sequence of disciplined recognitions. Lilienthal had shown that the air could be entered. His death had shown that entering it was not enough. The literature had shown what was known. Experience had shown what was missing. Their own mechanical instincts had shown where to begin. In those few years, the subject changed in their minds from a grand human longing into a technical undertaking that demanded patience, courage, and exact thought. Once they had reached that point, it became difficult for them to turn away. The problem had found them, and they had found their method of approaching it. What lay ahead would bring frustration, doubt, and repeated failure, but it would also bring the first real tests of the conviction that had now taken root, that flight would belong not to the man who merely rose into the air, but to the man who learned how to govern himself there. By the autumn of 1900, Wilbur and Orville Wright had moved beyond the stage of reading and small experiments. Their 5-foot kite had confirmed that wing warping offered a workable means of lateral control, and that success had given their thinking a firmer shape. Yet it had also made the next question unavoidable. A kite could suggest possibilities, but it could not reveal what a full-sized glider would do with a human being aboard. Sooner or later, they would have to place themselves inside the problem. They would have to leave Dayton, find strong and steady winds, and test their ideas against the open air. It was one thing to reason about flight in a bicycle shop. It was another to stand on bare ground beneath a restless sky and trust one's theories to canvas, wood, and wind. Their search for a suitable testing ground was methodical from the beginning. They needed isolation, not for romance but for practicality. Experiments with gliders required room, privacy, and favorable winds. Soft sand would make crashes more survivable. Hills or dunes would provide launching points. Just as important, the location had to be remote enough that their work could proceed without constant interruption. After consulting weather data from the United States Weather Bureau, they became interested in the coast of North Carolina, where strong winds and sandy terrain seemed promising. Kitty Hawk, on the Outer Banks, was suggested to them through correspondence with the local weather station. And the place soon took hold in their minds. Kitty Hawk was not yet the symbolic landscape it would later become. At the time, it was a small and difficult place, remote from the centers of American industry and science, reached only with effort. The Outer Banks were narrow strips of sand between ocean and sound, exposed to wind, weather, and isolation. Life there moved according to the sea, the seasons, and the limits imposed by distance. For the Wright brothers, this remoteness was not a disadvantage. It was part of the attraction. Aviation in those years had little institutional structure, no well-equipped national testing grounds, no established laboratories devoted to solving the problem of flight. If they wanted to experiment, they had to make their own conditions. Kitty Hawk offered not comfort, but usefulness. Wilbur arrived first in September of 1900 and made his way to the area near Kitty Hawk and Kill Devil Hills. Orville joined him shortly afterward. They camped, lived simply, and prepared to assemble the glider they had brought from Dayton. The machine was based on the biplane kite of the previous year, but enlarged to carry a pilot. It had a wingspan of roughly 17 feet, used wing warping for lateral control, and included a forward horizontal surface intended to act as an elevator. This front elevator was itself a notable choice. Rather than placing the control surface at the rear in the manner that later aircraft would commonly do, the brothers put it in front, where they believed it could help regulate pitch and perhaps protect the pilot in a crash. It was another sign that they were thinking about flight as an integrated problem of control. The setting tested them from the first day. The conditions they had sought were real enough, but they brought difficulties of their own. The sand invaded everything. Wind could be helpful one moment and vexing the next. Supplies were limited, living arrangements were rough, and every task demanded physical effort before any scientific work could begin. These hardships mattered, though the brothers seldom dramatized them. Their work at Kitty Hawk was not a neat laboratory exercise. It was a mixture of engineering, endurance, weather judgment, and plain bodily labor. They had to build shelters, move equipment, repair damage, and adapt constantly to circumstances. Their patience in such conditions reveals much about their character. They were not simply inspired men chasing a dream. They were practical men, willing to be uncomfortable for the sake of evidence. The 1900 glider did not at first fly with a pilot as fully as they had hoped. Much of the testing took place as a kite, tethered and controlled from the ground, because the winds were strong enough to support such experiments, and because this allowed the brothers to study the machine's behavior more safely. In this form, the gliders showed encouraging signs. Wing warping seemed workable. The elevator could affect pitch. The craft was responsive enough to justify further effort. When flown as a man-carrying glider, however, its performance was more limited. It did not generate as much lift as the brothers expected from the published aerodynamic data on which they had relied, especially the figures associated with Lilienthal. Even so, the season was not a failure. They made a number of short glides, gained direct experience in handling a larger aircraft, and returned to Dayton convinced that progress was possible. That conviction is one of the most important things to understand about the first Kitty Hawk season. The 1900 glider did not solve the problem of flight, but it gave the brothers something they had never had before: first-hand knowledge of how a man-carrying aircraft behaved in the wind. No book could substitute for that. They learned what it meant to feel the machine answer, hesitate or drift. They learned how difficult it was to balance theoretical expectation against actual performance. They learned that control surfaces could work in principle while still being awkward in execution. These were not triumphant lessons, but they were real, and real lessons were exactly what they wanted. Back in Dayton, they reflected on what they had seen. Their method remained steady. They did not announce success where success had not been achieved, nor did they let disappointment drive them into confusion. They studied the glider's shortcomings and prepared a second machine for the following year. This new glider, tested in 1901, was larger and built on the assumption that increased wing area would solve the lift problem they had observed. The brothers were still relying on the best aerodynamic information then available, and they designed accordingly. In this, as in much else, their progress was marked by trust followed by verification. They were willing to begin from accepted data, but only until experience proved whether the data deserved that trust. When they returned to the Outer Banks in the summer of 1901, they did so with higher hopes. The second glider had a wingspan of about 22 feet and a substantially larger wing surface. On paper, it should have delivered much better performance than the earlier machine. The logic seemed sound. If the first craft had not produced enough lift, then a larger one built from the same general principles should improve matters. Yet this was precisely the kind of reasoning that aviation, in its unfinished state, was capable of betraying. The air did not behave as obediently as printed tables suggested it should. The 1901 season was far more discouraging than the first. The glider again fell short of expectations in lift, and its handling characteristics proved troublesome. The brothers found that the machine did not perform according to the accepted coefficients they had used in its design. Worse still, the craft displayed unsettling tendencies in pitch and control. The elevator could overreact, and the machine's motions could become difficult to predict. At times it seemed to answer the pilot too sharply, then not sharply enough. What they had hoped would be a larger, more capable glider became instead a sharper encounter with uncertainty. This was the stage at which many experimenters might have retreated into excuses. The brothers did not. They were frustrated, certainly, and the frustration was profound because it struck at the level of fundamentals. If the published data on lift were wrong or incomplete, then the entire field rested on insecure ground. If the machine could not be trusted to behave consistently in the air, then no amount of confidence or bravery would carry them much farther. For Wilbur and Orville, who had approached flight as a technical problem to be solved through disciplined reasoning, this was not merely an inconvenience. It was an intellectual crisis. Their letters and later recollections suggest how serious the discouragement became. Wilbur, in particular, seems to have felt the weight of failure deeply in these months. He had entered the work with controlled determination, not public enthusiasm, and so disappointment did not express itself in grand emotional terms. It appeared instead as a hardening doubt about whether the path ahead was sound at all. At one point, after the poor results of the 1901 experiments, he remarked in substance that man would not fly for a long time, perhaps for 50 years. The statement is striking not because it was accurate, which it was not, but because it shows the depth of his disillusion at that moment. Coming from Wilbur, such pessimism was not casual. It arose from the sense that the technical basis of the problem might be more broken than he had expected. The isolation of their effort made this period more difficult still. They were not part of a large institution with researchers to consult down the hall. They had no government laboratory ready to test theories on their behalf. There was no organized field of aeronautical engineering to absorb failure and distribute insight. Their work remained largely private, self-financed, and self-correcting. In one sense, this independence protected them from outside pressure and fashionable error. In another, it left them almost alone with the consequences of their own uncertainty. On the dunes near Kitty Hawk, the brothers were not representatives of an established science. They were two men trying to learn whether the science itself was adequate, and yet it was precisely here, at the point of deepest discouragement, that the strength of their minds became most evident. They did not respond to failure by abandoning reason. They responded by questioning the assumptions behind their work. This is a different kind of resilience than simple persistence. Persistence alone keeps one moving. The brothers possessed that, but they also had the rare ability to stop and ask whether they had been relying on faulty premises. The trouble, they began to suspect was not that they were poor mechanics or clumsy pilots. The trouble might lie in the accepted aerodynamic tables themselves. That realization did not arrive in a flash. It emerged from repeated disappointment, careful observation, and comparison between expected and actual results. The machine should have lifted more than it did. It should have behaved better than it did. Since it did not, the brothers began to suspect that the problem was not merely in construction, but in knowledge. This was a pivotal change. Up to that point, they had worked largely within the framework handed down by earlier investigators. Now they were moving toward the idea that they would have to rebuild parts of that framework for themselves. The 1901 season also sharpened their understanding of control. Their original insight that control mattered more than power alone had not been disproved. If anything, it had been confirmed by hardship. The gliders showed again and again that getting into the air was only the beginning. Once airborne, the machine had to be managed along multiple axes, and disturbances could not simply be ignored. Pitch, roll, and the broader relation between surfaces and airflow were proving more interdependent than many experimenters had appreciated. The brothers were learning, through frustration, that flight was not a collection of separate problems, but a connected system. When they left Kitty Hawk after the second season, they carried home less visible success than they had hoped, but more valuable knowledge than many would have recognized. They had not achieved reliable gliding performance. They had not confirmed the correctness of accepted formulas. They had not yet built a machine that satisfied them. In that sense, the season had been disappointing to the point of near defeat. Yet they now possessed a clearer understanding of where the real obstacles lay. The problem was deeper than they had first thought, but it was also more precisely defined. These were the months in which the project came closest to ending before it had truly begun. The brothers had spent time, money, and physical effort on repeated trials in difficult conditions, only to find themselves confronting flawed data and stubborn instability. Had they been seeking applause, they might have quit. Had they been driven mainly by spectacle, they might have turned toward wilder claims or looser thinking. Instead, they paused at the edge of abandonment and considered whether the work could proceed on firmer ground. This pause was not weakness. It was one of the most honest moments in their entire story. What saved the project was not optimism in any simple sense. It was the brothers' unwillingness to accept confusion where measurement might be possible. They were deeply dissatisfied, but dissatisfaction itself became productive. Rather than deciding that flight was impossible, they became more and more convinced that existing aeronautical knowledge was inadequate. If that was true, then the only honorable course was to acquire better knowledge. Their near abandonment of the work therefore became, almost paradoxically, the threshold of their greatest advance. The failures at Kitty Hawk did not merely test their endurance. They forced a change in method. Seen from a distance, the early glider years can look like a rough prelude before success. In truth, they were much more than that. They were the stage on which the Wright brothers discovered that the accepted path toward flight could not simply be followed. The winds of Kitty Hawk stripped away confidence based on secondhand authority. The disappointing lift of the gliders, the awkward behavior of the elevator, the repeated mismatch between expectation and reality, all combined to teach them that aviation would not be mastered by inheritance. It had to be re-examined from the beginning, with fresh measurements and stricter discipline. So the trials at Kitty Hawk ended not with triumph, but with something more severe and ultimately more fruitful. Wilbur and Orville returned from the dunes, chastened, uncertain, and burdened by real doubt. Yet they also returned with the one thing that can transform failure into discovery: a better question. They no longer asked only how to build a flying machine. They asked whether the data on which all such machines were being designed could be trusted at all. In that question lay the turning point of their work. The wind had resisted them, the gliders had disappointed them, and for a time the dream itself seemed to recede. But beneath the discouragement, something stronger was forming. They were learning that progress in flight would require not just courage in the field, but a new foundation of exact knowledge. That realization would take them back to Dayton, away from the dunes for a time, and toward the experiments that would change everything. When Wilbur and Orville Wright returned to Dayton after the unhappy glider season of 1901, they carried back more than damaged hopes. They brought with them a suspicion that would change the entire course of aviation. Their failures at Kitty Hawk had not seemed random. The machines had fallen short in ways too consistent to be explained by poor luck alone. The lift was less than expected. The handling was more troublesome than the accepted theories suggested it should be. Again and again, the air had contradicted the tables on which they had relied. Many experimenters in that position might have concluded only that the work was difficult. The brothers reached a more dangerous and more fruitful conclusion. They began to think that the existing data themselves might be wrong. That realization marked a turning point not merely in their own work, but in the history of flight. Up to this moment, they had been serious students and increasingly capable experimenters. Yet they were still working within a body of aeronautical knowledge inherited from others. Otto Lilienthal's tables, long treated with respect, had shaped their assumptions about lift. The accepted Smeaton coefficient, used in calculations of air pressure, stood as another inherited constant. Their glider disappointments forced them to ask whether those foundations were sound enough for the task before them. It was an exacting question because it meant mistrusting not only isolated opinions, but some of the best available authorities in the field. The brothers did not reach this point through arrogance. They reached it through repeated contradiction between theory and experience. The wind itself had become their critic. What followed in Dayton during the closing months of 1901 was one of the most important acts of private scientific ingenuity in modern history. Rather than returning immediately to another set of field trials, they chose to investigate the principles behind their failures. In the back of their bicycle shop, using ordinary materials and the disciplined habits they had formed through years of mechanical work, they built a small wind tunnel. It was not large, but size was not the point. What mattered was that it allowed them to create controlled airflow and to compare one wing form against another under repeatable conditions. In aviation up to that time, much depended on open-air trial, visual judgment, and theoretical inheritance. The wind tunnel gave the brothers something far more powerful, a way to interrogate the air systematically. There is something especially revealing in the modesty of this scene. No university laboratory stood behind them. No government bureau supplied funding or assistance. The apparatus was built by two bicycle makers in a shop in Dayton, because no one else was going to answer the questions that now troubled them. That independence was not only a matter of necessity, it had become a principle of their method. If trustworthy knowledge did not yet exist, they would make the conditions in which it could be produced. In this sense, the wind tunnel was more than a device. It was a declaration that aviation would have to become an experimental science, not merely a field of brave guesses and dramatic claims. Inside the tunnel, they placed carefully designed balances that allowed them to measure lift and drag with much greater precision than had previously been possible in their own work. Then they began to test wing shapes. During late October and early November, they examined some 200 different airfoil forms, varying camber, aspect, and other characteristics in order to see how each behaved in the moving air. The labor was patient and repetitive. It demanded exact observation, small adjustments, and the willingness to trust numbers over expectation. This, too, was characteristic of the brothers. They were not searching for a single dramatic insight that would rescue the project in an afternoon. They were rebuilding certainty, piece by piece. The results were both surprising and clarifying. By mid-December of 1901, the brothers had determined that Lilienthal's lift tables were not, in the main, the chief source of error they had suspected. Instead, the larger problem lay with the commonly accepted Smeaton coefficient, the value used to estimate the pressure of air in aerodynamic calculations. They also found that the pronounced camber associated with Lilienthal's wings was less efficient than they had thought. These discoveries mattered because they shifted the entire basis on which wing design could proceed. The brothers now possessed not a vague sense that something was wrong, but a set of measured corrections. Their disappointment at Kitty Hawk had been translated into knowledge. One can hardly overstate the importance of that change in mood. Failure endured in the field can wear down even the most determined mind, especially when the causes of failure remain obscure, but measured understanding restores purpose. The brothers now knew more precisely why their earlier gliders had disappointed them, and they could design again with greater confidence. This did not mean the whole problem was solved. Flight still required the successful integration of lift, control, structural design, and piloting skill. Yet the ground beneath them was firmer. For the first time, they were not relying chiefly on inherited aeronautical numbers. They were relying on data of their own making. That fact transformed their position from that of able followers into that of original investigators. At the same time, their understanding of control continued to deepen. From the beginning, they had believed that the central challenge of flight was not merely to rise into the air, but to remain governable there. The glider failures had only confirmed this conviction. Their early kite had demonstrated that wing warping could manage lateral balance. The forward elevator gave them a means of controlling pitch. But another issue had emerged in the field. When the wings were warped to correct roll, the machine's behavior could introduce new directional problems. A flying machine did not move along one axis at a time. Its motions were linked. To manage one tendency effectively, the pilot needed coordinated authority over others as well. Out of this realization came one of the brothers' greatest conceptual achievements: the development of a true three-axis control system. A practical aircraft, they understood, would need independent yet coordinated means of governing pitch, roll, and yaw. The elevator controlled up and down motion at the nose. Wing warping controlled the banking of the wings. To these, they now added a movable vertical rudder at the rear, linked in operation to the wing warping, so the directional balance could be maintained as the aircraft turned and corrected itself. This was not merely an added component. It was an architecture of control, a way of thinking about flight as dynamic balance in 3 dimensions. The Library of Congress and the National Park Service both recognized the 1902 glider as the first machine to embody these 3 distinct sets of controls. That step was as intellectually significant as their corrected lift data. Many experimenters before them had built gliders or powered models. Some had risen briefly into the air, but the brothers were moving toward something more fundamental: a system by which a pilot could actively command the machine through the changing conditions of flight. This, more than any single component, was the deep reason their work was advancing where others stalled. They were not pursuing flight as a single event of takeoff. They were pursuing sustained mastery in the air. A machine that could not be balanced, corrected, and turned under control would never become practical, no matter how often it left the ground. Armed with new data from the wind tunnel and a refined system of control, the brothers returned to the Outer Banks in 1902. The new glider they brought to Kill Devil Hills looked in some ways like the continuation of earlier work, but inwardly it represented a major advance. Its wing design reflected their own corrected aerodynamic findings. Its control arrangement was more complete and more intelligently integrated than before. Their earlier seasons had taught them caution, but not timidity. They came back not with grand claims, but with a machine they had reason to trust more deeply than any previous one. The difference soon became clear. During the 1902 season, the glider performed with a degree of reliability and control they had never before achieved. The machine generated better lift, responded more effectively, and, most importantly, could be managed in a sustained and intentional way. The addition of the rear rudder, working together with the wing warping system, allowed the brothers to resolve the directional difficulties that had plagued earlier efforts. Here, at last, was not just gliding, but controlled gliding. The phrase matters. Others had floated through the air before them in varying degrees. The Wright brothers were now demonstrating repeated command over a heavier-than aircraft. These flights were not isolated accidents. That is what gave them their true weight. Repetition is one of the great proofs in engineering. A thing done once may still be luck, or some unstable conjunction of conditions. A thing done many times under changing circumstances begins to show that a principle has been mastered. During the 1902 tests, the brothers made hundreds of glides, learning from each one and gaining confidence in the machine's capabilities. They were no longer simply asking whether man could glide. They were discovering how a controlled aircraft behaved, how it turned, how it recovered, and how a pilot's body and judgment could work together with carefully designed controls. There was triumph in this, but it was the brothers' kind of triumph: quiet, methodical, and inseparable from work. They had not arrived through spectacle. They had arrived through correction. The wind tunnel, with its 200 tested wing forms, had given them better numbers. Their reflections on linked motion had given them 3-axis control. Their field trials had then confirmed that these ideas were not merely elegant, but effective. The path from discouragement to breakthrough had not passed through confidence alone. It had passed through humility before evidence. That humility, paradoxically, was one of the chief sources of their boldness. Because they trusted measurement, they could dare more in design. The significance of the 1902 glider is sometimes overshadowed by the fame of the powered flight that followed a year later. In many respects, the glider was the more decisive intellectual achievement. Power, though difficult, was never the deepest mystery for the brothers. They had long believed that engines and propellers could be solved once control had been mastered. The 1902 machine proved that their belief had been justified. It showed that a pilot could direct an aircraft through the air along all three principal axes of motion. In this sense, the essential form of modern flight had already been discovered before an engine was ever added. There is also a broader historical meaning in what they accomplished during these months. The turn of the 20th century was an age increasingly shaped by measurement, experiment, and the belief that difficult problems yielded best to disciplined inquiry. The Wright brothers, though outside the formal institutions of science, belonged fully to that age at its best. They did not merely inherit industrial skill. They transformed it into research in a bicycle shop in Dayton and on the dunes of North Carolina. They practiced a kind of engineering that joined craft to theory, and theory back again to trial. They had little institutional support, yet they had something no institution could guarantee: a partnership grounded in patience, rigor, and complete mutual trust. By the end of 1902, the entire Wright project stood on new footing. The failures of the previous season had not destroyed the work. They had purified it. The brothers now had reliable aerodynamic data of their own, a glider that could truly be controlled, and a clearer vision of what remained to be done. What remained was still formidable. To leave the ground under engine power, to sustain flight, and to land safely would require a lightweight motor, efficient propellers, and continued structural refinement. But these were now secondary challenges in a very important sense. The deepest riddle of flight, the question of control, had been answered in principle. So this period, from the autumn of 1901 through the close of 1902, stands as the true breakthrough in their understanding of flight. They began in discouragement, nearly defeated by bad data and stubborn failure. They responded by building a wind tunnel, testing some 200 wing shapes, correcting the aerodynamic assumptions on which their gliders had been designed, and inventing the first workable three-axis control system. They ended with a machine that could do what no earlier one had done so well: fly under sustained human control. It was not yet the famous powered airplane, but it was the necessary foundation of that airplane. The sky had not yet been conquered, but it had at last become intelligible. In that achievement there was a quiet triumph more profound than public applause. Two brothers, working largely alone, had taken one of humanity's oldest dreams and brought it within the reach of exact knowledge. By the beginning of 1903, Wilbur and Orville Wright had already solved the problem that mattered most to them. They had learned how to control a flying machine in the air. Their glider of the previous year had shown that a pilot could manage pitch, roll, and yaw through an integrated system of controls, and this achievement gave their work a solidity that earlier aviation efforts had often lacked. Yet, however important that breakthrough was, the world would not remember them primarily for gliding. The next step, and the one that would place their names permanently in history, was to carry that system of control into a machine that could lift itself from the ground under its own power. In 1903, their task was no longer to ask whether controlled flight was possible. It was to build the machine that could prove it. The challenge before them was formidable, but it was now clear in outline. They needed an aircraft light enough to rise, strong enough to endure the strain of operation, and controlled well enough to remain manageable once airborne. They also needed a means of propulsion that existing manufacturers were not prepared to supply. In an age before aviation had become an industry, no catalog offered what they required. The brothers had looked for an engine meeting their needs and found that none available could provide the necessary combination of power and low weight. Once again, the practical difficulties of invention forced them back on their own resources. As before, this did not discourage them so much as to find the work more precisely. If the right engine could not be bought, it would have to be made. Here another figure entered their story in a quiet but essential way. Charlie Taylor, the skilled machinist who worked in the Wright bicycle shop, became central to the effort. Taylor understood tools, metal, tolerances, and the everyday discipline of machine work. Working from the brothers' general requirements, he helped design and build a simple but effective four-cylinder gasoline engine. It was not elegant in the ornamental sense, nor was it the product of some great industrial laboratory. It was an engine made for a specific purpose by men accustomed to solving problems directly. What mattered was that it produced enough power while remaining light enough for the machine the brothers had in mind. This, like so much else in their progress, was a victory of exact necessity over grand appearance. The airplane they designed around this engine came to be known as the Flyer. It was in many ways the practical culmination of all their earlier work. It retained the biplane structure they had already tested in gliders. It used wing warping for roll control, a forward elevator for pitch, and a rear rudder for yaw. The pilot would lie prone on the lower wing, reducing air resistance. Chains and sprockets, familiar from bicycle work, transmitted power from the engine to two large pusher propellers. Even the propellers themselves required original thought. The brothers eventually understood that a propeller was not simply a screw turning in air, but a rotating wing that had to be designed according to aerodynamic principles. As with so many parts of their machine, they found little dependable guidance in existing practice and were forced to reason the matter out for themselves. That the Flyer was a machine of wood, wire, fabric, and handmade metal parts has sometimes made it seem fragile to later generations. In truth, it was as strong as the demands of its time and purpose required, though never immune to the risks that attended pioneering work. It was not built for comfort, beauty, or mass production. It was built to answer a question. Could a manned heavier-than-air machine, carrying its own power plant, take off into the wind, remain under control, and sustain itself in flight? Every line of the Flyer pointed toward that single test. In September of 1903, the brothers returned to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They set up camp once again near Kill Devil Hills, not far from Kitty Hawk, in the landscape that had already tested and educated them through previous seasons of gliding. The place was familiar now, though it had lost none of its severity. Wind, sand, and exposure shaped daily life just as before. Supplies were limited, weather uncertain, and every effort required physical labor before any scientific progress could be made. But there was also a certain grim advantage in returning to this isolated ground. The brothers knew the air there. They knew the dunes, the gusts, the practical routines of camp life, and the value of privacy. What they were attempting would not unfold before large crowds or a prepared press. It would happen, if it happened at all, in the same remote setting where they had already learned to distrust appearances and trust only the machine's actual behavior. The months they spent there in 1903 were not a smooth march to triumph. The Flyer had to be assembled and adjusted. Weather delayed trials. The propeller shafts proved troublesome at one point, forcing repairs and further waiting. Such interruptions were part of the reality of invention. History remembers the day of success, but success itself is usually surrounded by long stretches of handling, measuring, correcting, and enduring delay. The brothers remained what they had always been: methodical, patient, and unwilling to hurry a machine beyond what understanding allowed. They also had to solve the problem of launching. Unlike later airplanes that could roll freely on wheels along prepared runways, the Flyer used a launching rail laid on the sand. The aircraft rested on a wheeled starting truck that ran along the rail, allowing it to gather speed under its own engine and into the headwind. This arrangement reflected the experimental nature of the work and the conditions in which it was undertaken. They were not operating from a permanent airfield. They were creating, by hand and with limited means, the narrow circumstance in which powered flight might become possible. On December 14, 1903, they made their first attempt. A coin toss gave Wilbur the right to pilot the machine. The Flyer rose from the rail and left the ground, but the flight was brief and ended in a stall and rough landing after only a few seconds. Though unsuccessful as a sustained powered flight, the attempt was still significant. The machine had lifted under its own power with a pilot aboard, yet the brothers did not mistake this incomplete effort for the full success they sought. Their standards remained strict. The Flyer had to do more than hop into the air. It had to be controlled and sustained. 3 days later, on the morning of December 17th, the conditions aligned more favorably. The wind was strong and cold, blowing over the sands with the force that had drawn them to the region in the first place. They prepared the Flyer on its rail. This time, Orville took the first turn as pilot. There were only a handful of witnesses, among them men from the nearby life-saving station. No great audience stood waiting. No ceremony marked the moment. What happened next would become one of the most famous events in modern history. But at the time, it unfolded with extraordinary simplicity. At 10:35 in the morning, Orville lay prone in the machine. the engine running, the propellers turning. The flyer moved along the rail into the wind, lifted from the ground, and entered the air. The first flight lasted 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. By later standards, it was a short and fragile thing. The aircraft wavered. The control was not smooth, and the machine was still difficult to manage. But none of that could alter its essential meaning. It was a sustained, controlled, powered flight of a heavier-than-air machine carrying a man. The long effort of the previous years had crossed its threshold. The brothers did not stop there. They made 3 more flights that day, alternating as pilot and continuing to learn from each attempt. Wilbur took the second and fourth flights, Orville the third. With each effort, they gained a little more command and a little more distance. The final flight, piloted by Wilbur, traveled 852 feet in 59 seconds before ending in a hard landing caused by the machine's contact with the ground after a gusty, uneven run through the air. Those 59 seconds were enough. They showed not merely that powered flight could occur, but that it could be extended under active human control. The flyer had done the work it was built to do. There is a temptation, looking back, to imagine the event is instantly recognized in all its grandeur. In truth, the moment was quieter than that. The witnesses saw something remarkable, but the world did not immediately understand what had happened. The brothers themselves were not given to display. They recorded the facts, sent a telegram home, and attended to the damaged machine. Soon afterward, a gust overturned the flyer on the ground and damaged it so severely that it never flew again. The first successful powered airplane ended its career on the same day it made history. There is something almost fitting in this. The machine was not meant to endure as a polished monument. It was meant to prove a principle. What made December 17th so important was not that the flight was long, nor that the machine looked mature in any finished sense. It was that the brothers had united in one functioning craft the necessary elements of practical aviation. Lift had been achieved through an airframe designed according to corrected aerodynamic data. Control had been secured through the system they had developed in gliders. Propulsion had been supplied by an engine and propellers built to meet the exact requirements of the task. The airplane was still difficult and imperfect, but the conceptual victory was complete. After that morning, the problem of powered human flight could no longer be honestly dismissed as fantasy. The feat also mattered because of the way it had been reached. The brothers did not succeed through accident, nor through reckless daring detached from understanding. Their work was cumulative. It proceeded from reading the kite experiments, from gliders to wind tunnel data, from corrected theory to refined design. Even the powered flyer was not a leap beyond their previous experience, so much as the next logical extension of it. This is one reason the achievement stands so firmly in history. It was not a lucky exception. It was the result of a coherent method. In the wider world, however, recognition came slowly. The scientific community and the press were not uniformly ready to accept the brothers' claim at once. Aviation at the turn of the century was full of hopeful assertions, exaggerated reports, and half-successes. Many readers had been disappointed before by announcements that promised more than they delivered. The brothers' own reserved manner also contributed to the muted response. They were not showmen. They did not flood the public with spectacle or seek immediate fame. They had accomplished something monumental, but they had done it in the same spirit with which they had run their bicycle shop, carefully, seriously, and without unnecessary noise. That reserve should not be mistaken for uncertainty about what they had done. They knew the importance of the achievement, even if they also knew how much work remained. The flyer of 1903 was not yet a practical traveling machine. It could not take off again and again with ease, nor remain aloft for long durations, nor operate with the reliability that later aircraft would require. But the essential fact had been established. A controlled, powered, heavier-than-air machine had flown. The age of practical aviation had opened, however quietly, on a cold morning before a small group of observers in coastal North Carolina. The historical meaning of that morning is difficult to overstate. In one sense, it was the culmination of decades of international effort by inventors, engineers, and dreamers who had pushed the question of flight closer and closer to solution. The Wright brothers did not emerge from a vacuum. They inherited ideas, examples, and unanswered problems from men like Cayley, Lilienthal, Chanute, and others. Yet in another sense, December 17th marked a distinct beginning. It showed that aviation would not belong merely to those who imagined the sky, nor even to those who first rose briefly into it, but to those who could combine science, mechanics, and control into a workable whole. It is also worth remembering that the brothers achieved this in a country still defining itself as a modern industrial power. The United States of 1903 was inventive, energetic, and increasingly confident, but it was not yet universally regarded as the natural center of advanced scientific accomplishment. The Wright brothers were not attached to an elite Eastern institution, nor to a military laboratory, nor to a great European engineering tradition. They were self-trained Americans from Dayton, Ohio, working with private means, a bicycle shop machinist, and the habits of exact thought formed through years of practical labor. Their success carried with it something of the national spirit of the age, though they themselves were too disciplined to indulge much in that symbolism. For Wilbur and Orville personally, the day must have brought a kind of inward confirmation more satisfying than outward praise. The years of uncertainty had been severe. They had doubted accepted data, endured discouraging field seasons, built their own instruments, and persisted through the loneliness of working largely outside established science. December 17th did not remove every difficulty ahead, but it justified the method by which they had lived and worked. Their belief that control was central had been right. Their decision to trust experiment over inherited assumption had been right. Their reliance on one another had been right. In the flyer's brief passage through the air, all those judgments were vindicated. And yet the tone of the moment remains, even now, quietly monumental rather than triumphant in any loud sense. The first flights were short. The machine was damaged. Public acclaim did not burst forth at once. The brothers returned from the field not as instantly celebrated heroes, but as inventors who knew they had crossed a threshold and must now continue. There is dignity in that restraint. Great changes in history do not always arrive to applause. Sometimes they begin in cold wind among a few witnesses, and only later reveal how profoundly the world has shifted. So the first powered flight was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the long uncertainty over whether a manned, powered, heavier-than-air craft could fly under control. It began the next phase of the brothers' work, which would involve refinement, repeated demonstration, and the struggle to persuade a skeptical world. But those later battles belong to another chapter. On December 17, 1903, the essential thing had already happened. 4 flights, the longest lasting 59 seconds, had carried human beings into a new age. The sky, which for centuries had belonged only to birds, weather, and imagination, had at last admitted a machine guided by human hands. In the 2 years after the first powered flight, the brothers entered a different kind of labor. The question of whether powered flight was possible had been answered on the sands of North Carolina, but that answer was still fragile. The machine of December 1903 had flown, yet it was not a practical aircraft in any broad sense. It had shown the principle, not completed the form. For Wilbur and Orville, this distinction mattered deeply. They were not interested in a single historic gesture detached from usefulness. Their minds turned almost immediately toward improvement. A flying machine, to justify itself fully, had to rise again and again, turn with confidence, remain aloft for longer periods, and be governed with a steadiness that made it more than an experimental triumph. So the years 1904 and 1905 became years of refinement, secrecy, and discipline. The brothers also understood that they now stood in a delicate position. They had crossed a threshold before almost anyone else. But priority in invention could be a precarious thing. A machine that had flown in relative isolation before a few witnesses still had to be protected in a world where claims, imitation, and competition move quickly. Their natural reserve, already strong, now acquired a sharper purpose. They did not rush to put every detail of their work before the public. They did not seek fame for its own sake. Instead, they turned inward, continued testing close to home, and gave increasing attention to the legal and commercial protection of what they had achieved. This caution would later frustrate some observers, but to the brothers it seemed entirely reasonable. They had labored too long and too carefully to give away the fruits of their work before securing their position. Back in Dayton, they found a place for further trials at Huffman Prairie, a pasture east of the city near Sims Station. Compared with the broad, windswept dunes of Kitty Hawk, the field was less dramatic and in some ways less favorable. It offered no steady ocean breeze and no great slopes of sand from which a glider could easily descend. Yet it had one decisive advantage. It was close to home. Here the brothers could work repeatedly, bring tools and materials more easily, and continue development without the heavy burden of travel and isolation that had marked their seasons on the Outer Banks. The choice reflected the new stage of their work. They were no longer merely proving that flight could occur. They were trying to turn flight into a repeatable practice. The machine they brought into the 1904 season, commonly known as Flyer 2, was based closely on the successful aircraft of 1903, but it was intended for more sustained use. In outward appearance, it resembled the first Flyer, and in spirit it remained part of the same continuous experiment. Yet the move to Huffman Prairie immediately showed that a successful machine in one setting was not automatically a fully dependable one in another. The winds near Dayton were weaker and less predictable than those at Kitty Hawk, and this made takeoff more difficult. The brothers therefore needed a better launching system to compensate for less favorable conditions. Out of this need came their use of a weight and derrick catapult arrangement, which helped accelerate the aircraft along its launching rail. Again, necessity pushed them toward invention. They did not abandon a setting because it was imperfect. They altered their methods to meet it. The early months at Huffman Prairie were difficult and at times discouraging. The brothers had become the first men to achieve controlled powered flight, but they had not been granted easy mastery afterward. Flyer 2 could leave the ground, but consistent control remained elusive, particularly when the goal expanded from straight-line movement to circular flight and repeated maneuver. Short flights were still possible. Longer ones demanded new judgment, finer coordination, and design improvements not yet fully made. The machine remained sensitive, and the air over the prairie did not forgive uncertainty. This period is important because it reminds us that the breakthrough of December 1903 did not deliver a mature airplane all at once. The brothers were still teaching the machine and themselves how to fly. There is something quietly impressive in their willingness to endure this awkward middle stage. Public memory often prefers clean moments of first success, but the actual making of a new technology usually depends on these more obscure seasons of imperfection. At Huffman Prairie, the brothers were no longer asking the grand initial question. They were wrestling with subtler and in some ways more demanding ones. How could an aircraft be launched reliably in ordinary inland conditions? How could it be kept under control long enough to become practically useful? How could turning flight be achieved without losing balance or wasting too much power? These were not questions likely to excite the public imagination in the same immediate way as first flight, but they were the questions that determined whether aviation would remain a novelty or become a real force in the world. During 1904, progress came slowly. The brothers made a series of flights, many brief, some ending in damage or frustration, and learned by repetition what could not be learned by theory alone. One of the major goals was to make a complete circle in the air, for such a turn would demonstrate a level of control far beyond the straight or nearly straight flights of earlier efforts. On September 20th, 1904, Wilbur finally succeeded in making the first full circle in an airplane. Even this achievement, however, was part of an unfinished process rather than the conclusion of it. The circles were wide, the machine still imperfect, and the overall performance not yet reliable enough to satisfy the brothers' own standards. They had advanced, but they had not yet arrived. What makes this stage especially revealing is the gap between what the world might have celebrated and what the brothers themselves were willing to accept. Many inventors would have taken these flights and turned them into louder public claims. Wilbur and Orville did not lack confidence, but their confidence was tied to a demanding sense of technical adequacy. A machine that could circle once under favorable conditions was not yet, in their judgment, a practical flyer. They wanted sustained operation, repeated turns, and a level of command that would allow flight to become something more than a precarious demonstration. Their caution was not modesty for its own sake. It was the mark of men who understood how much could still fail. This demanding standard shaped the redesign that led to Flyer 3 in 1905. Of all the brothers' early aircraft, this machine was in many ways the true turning point between experiment and practicality. Though it still descended from the Flyer line that began in 1903, it incorporated significant refinements born of hard experience. The brothers lengthened the aircraft and made important changes to the control arrangement and structural proportions. These changes were not cosmetic. They were responses to the machine's behavior in the air: instability, oversensitivity, and the difficulty of sustained control turning had taught them that the earlier flyers required deeper adjustment. Flyer 3 was the result of listening closely to what the previous machines had been telling them. With Flyer 3, their work acquired a new steadiness. The machine flew better, turned more surely, and remained aloft longer. It responded more as an instrument and less as a troublesome contrivance forever threatening to outrun the pilot's judgment. At Huffman Prairie in 1905, the brothers at last began to demonstrate what might fairly be called practical flight. They made repeated flights of increasing duration. They circled the field multiple times. They could stay in the air long enough for the achievement to cease being a brief exception and become instead an established capacity. What had been uncertain in 1904 became convincing in 1905. This distinction between first-powered flight and practical sustained flight is one of the most important in their whole story. The world naturally remembers the cold December morning on the Outer Banks, because that was the threshold. But thresholds alone do not create a technology that changes history. Flyer 3 did something equally important in a quieter way. It showed that an airplane could be operated as a controllable machine for meaningful periods of time. In October of 1905, Wilbur made a flight lasting over half an hour and covering more than 24 miles. Such a performance would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. More importantly, it was not a desperate improvisation. It was the outcome of careful refinement. For the brothers, this success must have brought a peculiar mixture of satisfaction and caution. They now knew that they possessed something of enormous value. They had not merely been first to fly. They had created the first airplane that could reasonably be called practical in operation. Yet this very fact increased their guardedness. To reveal the machine too widely before securing patents and business arrangements would expose them to imitation at the very moment when their advantage had become most real. Here, their natural temperaments aligned with the economic realities of industrial America. The late 19th and early 20th centuries placed immense importance on intellectual property. Inventions were not only ideas, they were assets, and assets had to be protected if inventors were to benefit from them rather than watch others do so. This concern was not abstract. Aviation was no longer an idle dream discussed by scattered enthusiasts. Around the world, interest in powered flight was growing. European experimenters, American rivals, military observers, and investors were beginning to sense that the field might soon move from isolated experiment into national significance. The brothers were fully aware that they were not working in a vacuum. Even if no rival had yet matched what they had done, others were trying. To lose legal control over their central method of aircraft control, especially wing warping and its integrated operation with other surfaces, would be to surrender much of what made their work distinctive. They therefore pursued patent protection with great seriousness. Their patent application, filed in 1903 and eventually granted in 1906, focused not on a single machine but on the control system that made controlled flight possible. This focus reveals once more where the brothers believed the true heart of their invention lay. Engines could vary, airframes could evolve, materials could change, but the principle of coordinated control over a flying machine was the decisive breakthrough. And it was that principle they wished to secure. They were not wrong in this. If one looks at the long history of aviation, the importance of their claim becomes clear. The practical airplane was not simply a powered kite. It was a machine governed through a system of control, and defending that system, they were defending the intellectual core of their achievement. Because of this, the years 1904 and 1905 were marked by limited publicity. A few local observers saw flights at Huffman Prairie, and reports did appear, but the brothers did not undertake broad public demonstrations designed to capture headlines. This restraint had costs. It contributed to skepticism in some quarters, because extraordinary claims unsupported by open spectacle are often slow to win belief. Yet the brothers accepted the cost for the sake of a larger strategy. They preferred temporary doubt to premature exposure. They were building not just a reputation, but a protected position from which future agreements might be made with governments, investors, or manufacturers. Their guardedness has sometimes been judged harshly, as though they should have offered their achievement freely to the world in a spirit of pure scientific openness. But such judgments can overlook the practical conditions in which they worked. Wilbur and Orville had not been financed by a state, a university, or a wealthy patron. They had spent years risking their own means, their own labor, and in a real sense, their own lives. The bicycle business had helped support their experiments, but by this stage, aviation itself had become the center of their future. To ask them to reveal everything without protection would have been to ask them to abandon the ordinary rights granted to other inventors in their age. Their caution was not merely personal defensiveness. It was a rational response to the industrial world around them. At the same time, there was something inward in their secrecy as well. The brothers had always preferred substance to display. They trusted proof, but they also trusted completeness. They did not want the public merely to gasp at a machine lifting from the ground. They wanted to present an airplane worthy of the name. That instinct, so admirable scientifically, also delayed recognition. They waited until they had something stronger, more convincing, and more defensible. In doing so, they preserved the seriousness of their work, though at the price of allowing some others to doubt or misunderstand them for a time. By the end of 1905, the essentials were in place. Flyer 3 had demonstrated sustained and controlled flight with turns and duration, sufficient to establish the brothers' mastery. Their patent strategy was underway. Their public posture remained restrained. The world had not yet fully caught up to what had happened at Huffman Prairie, but that did not change the fact itself. In the quiet fields near Dayton, away from grand institutions and before only scattered witnesses, the airplane had matured from a fragile proof into a practical machine. These years therefore stand as a bridge between invention and recognition. The first powered flight had opened the door. The refinements of Flyer 2 and Flyer 3 made it possible to walk through it. Wilbur and Orville emerged from this period not as dreamers who had briefly succeeded, but as disciplined engineers who had solved the central problems of practical flight. Yet they also emerged as men increasingly aware that invention alone would not determine the future. Law, business, publicity, and international competition were now approaching the edges of their work. The air had been entered and mastered to a remarkable degree, but the struggle to claim, defend, and present that mastery was only beginning. By the close of 1905, Wilbur and Orville Wright had already achieved something extraordinary in private. At Huffman Prairie, they had transformed the airplane from a fragile proof into a machine capable of sustained and controlled flight. Yet private mastery and public recognition are not the same thing. In the years that followed, from 1906 through 1909, the brothers passed through one of the most decisive transitions of their lives. They moved from guarded experiment into public demonstration, from local obscurity into international renown, and from the status of doubted inventors into figures whose work altered the ambitions of nations. It was a period of vindication, but not of ease. The world did not simply awaken one morning and grant them their place. That place had to be secured through patents, negotiations, demonstrations, and performances so convincing that even skepticism could no longer stand against them. One of the first formal signs of this change came with the granting of the United States patent on May 22, 1906. The patent protected their method of controlling a flying machine, especially the system of coordinated control that lay at the heart of practical flight. This mattered greatly to the brothers because they had long believed that control, more than mere power, was the essential breakthrough in aviation. Their claim was not centered on the simple fact that a machine could leave the ground. It was centered on the deeper achievement that made flight governable. By securing the patent, they gave legal form to what they had already established in practice: that the airplane was not just an engine with wings, but a controllable system. Even with the patent in hand, public certainty did not come at once. The brothers had been cautious for years, and their caution had protected their work, but also contributed to doubt. Many outside their circles still had not seen a full public demonstration. Aviation at the turn of the century was crowded with claims, speculations, and failures. Reports of flying machines often appeared before the machines themselves proved worthy of belief. In that atmosphere, the rights reserved could seem suspicious to those who had not followed the steady rigor of their work. Their challenge now was not only to protect what they had invented, but to reveal it in a form so undeniable that the world would have to adjust its understanding. By 1907 and early 1908, the brothers were negotiating with both American and European interests. Their success had become too substantial to remain indefinitely hidden, and governments were beginning to understand that aviation might have military significance. The brothers reached agreements with a French syndicate and with the United States War Department, each requiring demonstrations that the airplane could meet specified standards. These arrangements were important not only financially, but symbolically. For years, the brothers had worked largely at their own expense, outside major institutions. Now their machine was being weighed by nations, investors, and military authorities. The age of private experiment was giving way to the age of public consequence. The year 1908 became the true turning point. To fulfill the French agreement, Wilbur traveled to France and began preparing for demonstrations there. Europe, especially France, had become one of the great centers of aeronautical excitement. French experimenters and spectators alike followed aviation with intense interest, and there remained in many quarters real uncertainty about the Wrights' claims. Some admired them from a distance. Others doubted them outright. The atmosphere was competitive, curious, and quick to judge. When Wilbur began flying publicly near Le Mans in August of 1908, he was entering not a calm field of neutral observers, but an international arena in which reputation could rise or collapse within days. What happened in France changed everything. Wilbur's flights were not theatrical in style, but they were overwhelming in effect. He demonstrated turns, circles, sustained control, and durations far beyond what many spectators had imagined possible. In a country where aviation enthusiasm ran high, he showed a degree of mastery that astonished engineers, journalists, and the general public alike. Doubt gave way to admiration with remarkable speed. The issue was no longer whether the Wright brothers had truly flown before. It was clear now that they possessed a level of control and practical command that set them apart. In France, where serious aeronautical judgment carried international weight, Wilbur's demonstrations brought the brothers the validation they had long lacked. There is something especially striking in the way Wilbur won that acclaim. He did not do it through exaggeration or patriotic appeal. He did it by flying better than anyone expected a man could fly. The machine banked, circled, responded, and remained aloft with an assurance that turned speculation into fact. Spectators who had expected a clever novelty instead witnessed a coherent new technology. Engineers could study it. Journalists could describe it. Rivals could not dismiss it. The airplane ceased to be merely a reported invention from America and became, before European eyes, a living instrument of movement and control. Wilbur's success in France had an effect beyond applause. It altered the international standing of the brothers almost at once. Honors followed. Crowds gathered. Contracts and negotiations acquired new seriousness. What they had tried for years to establish through private work and careful claims was now being confirmed in public by direct performance. The vindication was especially powerful because it came in a setting where skepticism had been genuine. France did not merely applaud them politely. It recognized that the brothers had changed the technical standard by which aviation itself would be judged. At the same time, Orville was demonstrating the airplane in the United States for the Army at Fort Myer, Virginia. The War Department had offered a contract for a flying machine that could meet specific requirements, including speed and passenger carrying capability. Orville's flights in September of 1908 were the first full-scale public performances of a Wright airplane in the United States, and they drew enormous attention. Here, too, the brothers were moving from obscurity into visibility, but the American demonstrations carried an added burden. They were not only about reputation, they were tied directly to military acceptance and to the question of whether the airplane could become a useful national instrument. Those American demonstrations were touched by tragedy. On September 17, 1908, during a flight at Fort Myer with Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge as passenger, a propeller failed. The machine crashed. Selfridge was killed, and Orville was seriously injured. The event cast a shadow over what had been a season of rising recognition. It reminded the public and the brothers themselves that aviation remained dangerous, exacting, and technically unforgiving. It also interrupted the Army trials at a crucial moment. Yet even through grief and injury, the broader conclusion was not erased. The Army had seen enough to understand that the Wright machine represented something real and formidable. The crash delayed acceptance, but it did not destroy the brothers' standing. The contrast between Wilbur's triumph in France and Orville's accident in the United States gives the period much of its emotional complexity. Recognition was arriving, but not in a simple or wholly celebratory way. The world was beginning to admire the brothers just as the risks of their work were becoming unmistakably public. This mixture of vindication and danger belonged to the age itself. Aviation was emerging not as a harmless wonder, but as a powerful and unstable new capability. To fly was to enter a space of immense promise and real peril, and the Wright brothers stood at the center of that truth. Orville recovered, and in 1909 the brothers returned to complete what had been interrupted. They brought an improved military airplane back to Fort Myer, where the remaining trials were carried out successfully. The Army formally accepted the aircraft on August 2, 1909, making it Signal Corps Airplane No. 1, the first military airplane in the world. This acceptance was a landmark. It meant that the airplane had passed from experimental possibility into official service. Governments had been watching aviation with curiosity and caution. Now, one of them had bought an aircraft from the Wright brothers and incorporated it into military use. The strategic meaning of flight was beginning to emerge. That contract mattered for reasons beyond money or prestige. It signaled a new relationship between aviation and the modern state. The airplane was no longer only a machine of individual daring or inventive brilliance. It was becoming an instrument that armies might train with, purchase, and eventually build doctrines around. The brothers could not yet foresee the full scale of aviation's military future, but they were living at the threshold of it. Their work, born in a bicycle shop and tested on lonely fields and dunes, was now entering institutions of national power. Public recognition in the United States rose rapidly during the same period. The brothers were celebrated openly in ways that would have seemed improbable only a few years earlier. In France, Wilbur had astonished the European public. In America, the successful completion of the Army trials and the growing body of public evidence finally secured broad acknowledgement. The brothers were no longer figures half hidden behind patents, rumors, and guarded experiments. They had become symbols of invention, discipline, and national achievement. Their names entered public life, not merely as the names of skilled mechanics, but as those of men who had opened a new era. The speed with which their status changed is one of the remarkable features of these years. For a long time, they had existed at the edge of belief, known to some, doubted by many, and understood fully by very few. Then, through a small number of public performances, the balance shifted dramatically. Once people saw what the airplane could actually do, the brothers' earlier reserve was reinterpreted. What had looked to skeptics like questionable secrecy came to seem instead like the caution of men who had known the worth of their work before the world was ready to see it. Their long obscurity ended not because they argued louder, but because evidence at last became visible on a public stage. These years also made clear that aviation was becoming international in both ambition and consequence. The brothers' fame was not confined to Dayton or even to the United States. French admiration, military contracts, European negotiations, and international press coverage all showed that flight had entered a global contest of technology and prestige. Nations understood that the airplane could carry not only passengers or inventors, but influence. To master flight was to gain standing in a modern world, increasingly defined by speed, communication, and strategic reach. The brothers had begun with a technical puzzle. By 1909, that puzzle had become part of international rivalry and national aspiration. For Wilbur and Orville personally, the period must have brought a complicated sense of fulfillment. They had wanted recognition, but they had wanted it on terms worthy of the work. They had not sought applause detached from substance. Now the applause was finally arriving because the substance had become undeniable. Yet fame also carried new burdens. Public expectation grew, business commitments multiplied, legal and commercial questions pressed more urgently. The brothers' lives, once shaped by private discipline and relative obscurity, were now exposed to the demands that come when invention enters the world as a contested and celebrated fact. Still, there was real celebration in this period, and rightly so. The brothers had endured years of skepticism, isolation, failed trials, and the slow labor of proving what they themselves already knew to be possible. Their public demonstrations in France and the United States finally gave the wider world a chance to witness that truth directly. The result was transformative. Aviation was no longer a dream waiting for its first genuine practitioners. It had become a demonstrated reality, and the Wright brothers stood unmistakably at its center. By the end of 1909, the transition was complete. The patent had secured their central claim. The French flights had conquered European skepticism. The Army contract had placed their machine in official military service. International acclaim had lifted them from obscurity into history. They had moved, in only a few years, from guarded inventors protecting a breakthrough to public figures whose achievement was reshaping the modern world's sense of distance, power, and possibility. It was a vindication not only of their invention, but of their whole method, patient, disciplined, unspectacular in style, and revolutionary in result. The airplane had emerged from private experiment into global consequence, and with it the brothers themselves had entered a new and irreversible place in human history. By 1910, the triumph of recognition had already begun to change into something heavier. The years of obscurity were over. The Wright brothers were no longer two private experimenters working at the edge of belief, but public figures at the center of a new industry whose future was expanding faster than any one pair of hands could easily guide. Fame had brought contracts, business commitments, legal obligations, and the constant pressure of defending priority in a field that was becoming more crowded by the month. The airplane, once a problem they had pursued for its own sake, was now also a commercial property, a strategic tool, and a source of rivalry. For Wilbur and Orville, these years were marked less by the quiet exhilaration of discovery than by strain. In 1909, the Wright Company had been formed with the help of prominent financial backers in order to manufacture and market airplanes on a larger scale. Wilbur became its first president, while Orville served as a vice president. On paper, this looked like the natural next stage of their success. The inventors had proven the airplane and now stood ready to participate in the industrial future they had helped create. Yet the transition from inventing to managing was not an easy one, especially for men whose habits had been formed in a workshop rather than a corporate office. The company required administration, negotiation, production oversight, licensing decisions, and a constant balancing of technical, financial, and legal demands. The very success of the brothers' work now threatened to draw them away from the type of concentrated experimentation at which they had been best. Wilbur in particular took on a formidable share of this burden. He had long possessed the more severe and commanding mind in matters of organization and business judgment, and as the years after first recognition unfolded, he increasingly became the brother most deeply engaged in the company's affairs and in the legal struggles surrounding their patent. There was a grim logic in this. He had always been the more inwardly disciplined of the two, the one who could sustain prolonged intellectual pressure without display. But the qualities that made him effective also made him vulnerable to exhaustion. Business required not only judgment, but unending vigilance. And vigilance of that kind can wear down even the strongest constitution when it is joined to controversy and disappointment. At the heart of these years lay the patent disputes that have become one of the most contested parts of the Wright story. The brothers believed, with reason, that their patent protected the essential method of controlling an airplane in flight. They regarded coordinated control, rather than mere propulsion, as the core of practical aviation, and they were determined to defend that achievement. Glenn Curtiss emerged as the most famous rival in these disputes. Curtiss was himself an able and important aviation figure, and his work gained increasing prominence in the rapidly developing American field. The resulting litigation between the Wright interests and Curtiss became prolonged, bitter, and public. It was not a side issue in the brothers' later life. It became one of its defining pressures. To later generations, these legal battles can seem unfortunate or even regrettable, especially because American aviation would soon be judged, by some observers, to have lagged behind Europe in part because of the patent struggle. There is truth in that broader historical view. The National Park Service notes that the conflict between the Wrights and Curtiss especially held back technological development in the United States during those years. Yet from the brothers' own perspective, the matter was not simply greed or possessiveness. They had spent years risking their own means and labor to solve the problem of controlled flight. To them, defending their patent was defending the central intellectual breakthrough that had made the airplane possible. The tragedy was that a position grounded in legitimate principle became, over time, a consuming burden. The strain was intensified by the speed with which aviation itself was changing. Once an invention enters the world, it no longer belongs only to its inventors. It becomes part of a wider movement of ambition, imitation, improvement, and competition. By the early 19-teens, airplanes were evolving quickly in Europe and America alike. New designs appeared, new flyers entered the field. Exhibitions drew crowds and military interest deepened. The brothers, who had once stood almost alone against the unknown, now found themselves in the opposite position. They were pioneers trying to defend precedents in a field that was already moving beyond the narrow conditions of first invention. Their priority remained secure in the deepest historical sense, but the practical business of preserving advantage was exhausting and often joyless. The Wright Company itself embodied this tension. It represented success, but also the transformation of their work into an enterprise subject to industrial expectations. Factories, investors, production schedules, and commercial strategy all belonged to a world very different from the bicycle shop or the back room where they had built their wind tunnel. The company carried their name, yet the life demanded by such an organization did not naturally suit either brother. Orville retained his technical interests and public stature, but Wilbur bore much of the heavier organizational and legal load. The emotional weather of these years was therefore not celebratory. It was dense with responsibility. Still, the brothers continued to occupy a position of extraordinary prominence. Their names were spoken wherever aviation was discussed seriously. Their demonstrations of previous years still stood as landmarks. Their company trained pilots and produced aircraft. Their influence reached beyond American borders and into the broader modern understanding of what flight now meant. Yet prominence can conceal fatigue. A public figure may appear to be standing at the height of achievement, even while the inward structure of his strength is being steadily worn away. In Wilbur's case, this seems to have been true. The burdens of business and litigation did not simply occupy his time. They consumed reserves that had once been available for invention, reflection, and the quieter satisfactions of work done directly by hand and mind. By 1912, the pressure had become severe enough that Wilbur's health was no longer secure. In early May of that year, he contracted typhoid fever, likely from contaminated oysters according to the National Park Service account. What followed was a rapid decline over the course of the month. He grew steadily weaker at the family home on Hawthorne Street in Dayton, while those around him could do little but watch the illness take its course. For a man who had lived by concentrated will and disciplined effort, there is something especially tragic in the helplessness of this final illness. Technical problems could be attacked with patience and intelligence. Disease offered no such opening. Wilbur Wright died on May 30th, 1912, at the age of 45. His father, Milton Wright, wrote in his diary the words that have followed Wilbur ever since. A short life full of consequences. The phrase endures because it is both restrained and exact. Wilbur had not lived long by ordinary measure, yet few lives of equal length have altered the course of the modern world so deeply. He had helped solve one of humanity's oldest dreams, then spent his final years defending the results in a harsher and less satisfying arena. His death closed not only a life but a partnership unlike any other in the history of invention. The loss to Orville was profound. Their partnership had not been an arrangement of convenience that could simply be redistributed after one man's absence. It had been the central human fact of both their adult lives. Each had supplied something the other lacked, and together they had formed a working intelligence greater than either alone. With Wilbur gone, Orville inherited not only grief but responsibility. He became president of the Wright Company and executor of his brother's estate. Yet leadership after bereavement is not the same as partnership. The old balance was broken. The future might still be managed, but it could no longer be shared in the same way. There is a sadness in the timing of Wilbur's death that gives this chapter its particular weight. He died at a moment when aviation was expanding rapidly beyond the first circle of its pioneers. Airplanes were becoming more common in exhibitions and military thinking. Engineers elsewhere were already making modifications and extensions that would carry the field into forms the brothers themselves had only begun to imagine. Wilbur did not live to see the full transformation of the airplane into a central instrument of modern life. He had helped create the age of flight, but he left the world before that age fully unfolded. This lends his story a kind of unfinished quality, as though one of the principal minds of aviation had been removed while the machine he helped create was still gathering speed. The broader historical setting deepens the tragedy. Early aviation was entering a period of intensifying industrial competition and legal conflict. The field was no longer defined only by experimental courage. It had become entangled with capital, patents, manufacturing, and national ambition. In such an atmosphere, it was perhaps inevitable that some of the original romance of discovery would give way to dispute. Yet for the Wright brothers, who had approached flight through careful reasoning and quiet perseverance, the harshness of this transition carried a special cost. The years that should have been a time of unclouded recognition became instead a period of courtroom battles, business pressures, and physical decline. And yet it would be wrong to see these years only as a fall from greatness into strain. They were also years in which the brothers' achievement proved durable enough to matter beyond their own control. Revelry itself was evidence of significance. Lawsuits occur where something valuable is at stake. Business expansion occurs where a new world is opening. The burden they carried was heavy precisely because the airplane was no longer a speculative curiosity. It had become an object of power, investment, and national consequence. The sorrow of this section lies in the fact that the men who opened that new world were required to spend so much of their remaining shared life defending it. So the years from 1910 to 1912 stand as one of the most humanly difficult parts of the Wright story. Public success had arrived, but it brought litigation, administration, and fatigue rather than peace. The Wright Company expanded, but expansion pulled the brothers deeper into obligations far removed from the quiet discipline of invention. Wilbur, carrying a large portion of the burden, declined under the weight of business and legal cares before typhoid fever ended his life in Dayton on May 30th, 1912. With that death, one of history's greatest creative partnerships came to an end. The world of aviation moved on rapidly, as modern industries do. But it moved on carrying the marks of the brothers' labor and, now, their loss. After Wilbur Wright's death in 1912, the story of the brothers could no longer proceed in the form that had defined it from the beginning. For years, their work had been a shared mind expressed through two temperaments, each correcting and strengthening the other. With Wilbur gone, Orville entered a life that was at once public and solitary, honored and burdened, still influential yet permanently altered by absence. The great age of invention that they had opened continued to accelerate around him, but he now moved through it alone. Section 10, therefore, is not simply the last chapter of one life. It is also the long afterlife of a partnership, and the widening legacy of an achievement that quickly passed beyond the scale of the men who made it. In the years immediately following Wilbur's death, Orville remained closely tied to the aviation world. Though increasingly on different terms than before, he still carried the Wright name into public affairs and still represented to many people the living authority of the first flight. But the work itself was changing. Aviation was becoming industrial, institutional, and international at a pace that no pioneer could fully govern. Factories, patent disputes, military interests, engineering schools, exhibitions, and competing firms all pressed forward. The era in which two brothers could privately shape the course of flight through direct experiment was ending. In its place came a more complex modern world in which aviation would belong to companies, governments, and whole professions. Orville continued for a time in business, but he did not remain permanently suited to the corporate structure that had grown around the brothers' invention. In 1915, he sold his interest in the Wright Company. This decision marked another quiet turning point. It separated him from the direct commercial management of the enterprise that bore his name and that had once seemed the natural extension of the brothers' success. The sale was practical, but it was also revealing. Orville had never been, at heart, a man of corporate bureaucracy. His gifts lay in experimentation, mechanical understanding, and technical judgment. Once the airplane had become an industry, it belonged increasingly to a kind of life different from the one in which he had done his best work. Yet withdrawing from the company did not mean withdrawing from aviation. Orville remained one of the most respected figures in the field, and his later decades were shaped by advisory, commemorative, and public roles that kept him close to the development of flight even as it moved far beyond its earliest forms. He served on the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the body that later became part of the institutional ancestry of the American space program. In that capacity, he stood in a symbolic position of unusual depth. A man who had begun in a bicycle shop and on windswept dunes was now linked to the formal scientific and governmental structures of modern aeronautics. It was as though the whole arc of aviation, from handmade experiment to national research, could be traced within a single life. There must have been something strange in this for Orville. He had lived long enough to see flight transformed from a stubborn and doubtful problem into a central force in modern civilization. When he was young, the very idea of controlled-powered flight had seemed uncertain enough to border on fantasy. By middle age, aircraft were being improved, manufactured, sold, raced, displayed, and studied around the world. By later life, they had become indispensable to commerce, warfare, and national power. The pace of that transformation was almost without precedent. Most inventors do not live long enough to witness the full expansion of the worlds they help create. Orville did, and the experience must have carried both satisfaction and disquiet. His public reputation deepened over the years. Honors came from many directions. He was celebrated not only in the United States but abroad, recognized by institutions, civic bodies, and governments that understood increasingly well what the first flight had meant. Yet even as the honors accumulated, the nature of the recognition shifted. Early fame had been bound up with controversy, demonstration, and the struggle to prove a contested claim. Later fame became more reflective. Orville was no longer simply the younger of two embattled inventors defending priority. He had become, in the public imagination, one of the founding figures of the modern age. He represented not only the airplane's beginning, but the disciplined spirit of inquiry that had made that beginning possible. There is also something poignant in the way memory works across such a long life. Orville became the custodian, not just of his own achievements, but of Wilbur's memory as well. He lived on as the surviving half of a story the world increasingly told in simplified form. Statues, speeches, ceremonies, articles, and official recognitions all sought to preserve what the brothers had done. But memory has its own pressures. It tends to smooth complications, shorten struggles, and place invention into symbols easier to repeat than to understand. Orville, who knew how long and uncertain the path had really been, had to live within a public culture that celebrated the result more readily than the years of doubt, wrong data, failed gliders, and patient correction that had made the result possible. In this sense, he was not only an honored pioneer, he was also a witness to the simplification of his own past. Even so, he seems to have understood that such simplification was part of historical life. The first flight had become larger than private memory. It had entered the language of civilization itself. Schoolchildren learned the names Wilbur and Orville Wright as symbols of invention. Museums, memorials, and public sites preserved their tools, papers, bicycles, and aircraft. Places associated with their work, especially Dayton and the North Carolina coast, acquired a new historical dignity through their connection to the brothers' achievement. The local had become universal. A field, a shop, a family home, and a set of windswept dunes were now linked to one of humanity's greatest technological transitions. Orville's later years unfolded against the background of events the brothers could scarcely have foreseen in their youth. The First World War, which began in 1914, revealed with terrible speed how deeply aviation could alter warfare. Airplanes were used first for reconnaissance, then increasingly for combat, bombing, and strategic operations. The sky, which the brothers had entered through curiosity and patient experiment, became a domain of military competition and violence. By the Second World War, aviation had advanced so dramatically that entire campaigns depended upon aircraft, and cities could be reached from the air in ways no previous century had imagined. For a man who had once struggled to keep a fragile machine aloft for less than a minute, the scale of this development must have been overwhelming. It would be too simple to say that Orville merely rejoiced in aviation's expansion. Like many pioneers, he must have seen in later developments both vindication and unease. Flight had transformed travel, communication, and the human sense of distance. Journeys that once took days or weeks could now be made in hours. Oceans no longer seemed final barriers in quite the same way. Airmail, passenger services, military fleets, and global routes all emerged from the possibility the brothers had helped create. Yet the same technology also altered warfare with destructive power. The airplane became not only a vehicle of wonder and connection, but an instrument of organized force. Such ambiguity belongs to nearly every profound human invention. The Wright story is no exception. The machine that lifted humanity into a new dimension also gave humanity new ways to injure itself. Still, the positive transformations were immense and enduring. Civil aviation changed how people understood the world itself. Regions once separated by exhausting travel became newly accessible. Trade, diplomacy, journalism, migration, and tourism were all reshaped by the ability to move swiftly through the air. The psychological effect was as important as the practical one. The globe seemed smaller, more connected, and more immediately knowable. The old relationship between distance and human effort had been permanently altered. In this sense, the brothers' achievement belongs not only to engineering history, but to the history of consciousness. They changed what human beings could expect from the world. Orville lived long enough to see commercial aviation become a settled fact of modern life. Airplanes improved in speed, range, reliability, and comfort. Airports grew. Airlines emerged. The once impossible became ordinary. This transition from marvel to routine is one of the surest signs that an invention has truly entered civilization. The extraordinary becomes infrastructural. It ceases to be discussed only as a breakthrough and begins to organize daily life. Orville, who had once helped build the first engine because none suitable could be bought, now inhabited a world where complex aircraft crossed continents on regular schedules. It is difficult not to feel the strange dignity of that contrast. His own life in these later decades seems to have retained a certain quietness, despite honors and public standing. He remained in Dayton, connected to the places where the brothers had lived and worked. He was not remade into a purely ceremonial figure, nor did he become detached from the material history of aviation. He advised, observed, corresponded, and participated in the preservation of the legacy that had by then become inseparable from national and international history. There is a continuity in this. The same man who once measured wing surfaces and adjusted machines by hand now moved through a world that treated his earlier life as foundational history. Yet he remained recognizably himself, practical, attentive, and never wholly given over to grandiosity. Orville Wright died on January 30th, 1948, at the age of 76. His death came at a moment of extraordinary historical symbolism. Only months earlier, the sound barrier had been broken, an achievement that would have seemed almost unimaginable at the time of the first flight. In the span of his lifetime, humanity had moved from doubtful gliders and handmade propellers to supersonic speed. Few individual lives have contained such a dramatic technological arc. Orville's death therefore marked more than the passing of a famous inventor. It marked the disappearance of one of the last living links to the dawn of powered flight. At a moment when aviation had already advanced into forms that pointed toward the jet age, and, beyond that, toward space. If Wilbur's death in 1912 brought tragic brevity to one half of the story, Orville's longer life gave the story breadth. Through him, the achievement of the Wright brothers was carried across the first half of the 20th century into an era of mass aviation, global war, and scientific institutions far beyond the scale of the brothers' original world. Yet even this long life does not exhaust their legacy. The deeper meaning of the Wright brothers lies not only in the fact that they flew first, though that remains monumental, but in the way they solved the problem. Their legacy is methodological as much as mechanical. They showed that one of humanity's oldest dreams could be brought within reach not by theatrical daring alone, nor by abstract theory alone, but by the disciplined union of reading, experiment, craftsmanship, patience, and independent thought. They were not backed by the largest institutions of their time. They did not enter the problem with superior wealth or political power. What distinguished them was their way of thinking. They respected earlier work without becoming captive to it. They trusted evidence more than inherited authority. They broke a grand, impossible-seeming question into parts that could be tested, and they understood, more clearly than most of their contemporaries, that control lay at the heart of practical flight. In that sense, their legacy reaches beyond aviation. It belongs to the history of how difficult problems are solved. The partnership itself remains one of the most remarkable in modern history. Wilbur and Orville were not simply two inventors who happened to work side by side. Their collaboration was the instrument of their success. Each supplied qualities the other lacked. Wilbur brought intellectual severity, strategic patience, and analytical depth. Orville brought mechanical fluency, experimental agility, and a practical inventiveness of rare kind. Their unity was strengthened by trust so complete that rivalry never consumed it. Many breakthroughs are attributed to singular genius because singular genius is easier to remember. The Wright story resists that simplification. It reminds us that some of the greatest human achievements are made not by isolated brilliance, but by minds working in durable harmony. Their family background also forms part of the enduring meaning of their legacy. The household of Milton and Susan Wright offered books, argument, mechanical curiosity, and the habit of self-education. Out of that domestic world came two men capable of changing the world itself. This is worth remembering because it restores the human scale of the achievement. The origins of the airplane are not only in laboratories or factories. They are in a family library, a mother's practical intelligence, a toy helicopter brought home by a father, a bicycle shop, a print shop, and years of reading and making. The path to the sky began in ordinary rooms. The legacy of the Wright brothers also survives physically, in artifacts, places, and institutions. The camp at Kill Devil Hills, the Dayton workshops, the family home, the papers they left behind, the surviving aircraft, and the museums that preserve them all make possible a kind of historical nearness. One can still stand, in a way, inside the geography of first flight. Yet the most profound memorial to the brothers is not any single monument. It is the continued presence of flight itself in human life. Every passenger airplane crossing an ocean, every aircraft carrying medicine or food or mail, every research plane, rescue helicopter, or satellite launching infrastructure linked to aeronautical principles bears, however indirectly, the mark of what they began. Modern technology, of course, has moved far beyond fabric-covered wings and hand-built propellers. Aircraft now depend on materials, engines, electronics, and computational systems the brothers could never have fully imagined. Jet travel, radar, avionics, spacecraft guidance, and global logistics all belong to later chapters. But the line of inheritance remains visible. Once the airplane became a controllable machine, the future of aeronautics and eventually astronautics opened before humanity in a new way. The first flight did not contain every later advance in completed form, but it changed what progress itself could mean. It shifted the horizon. That may be the deepest reason the Wright brothers continue to matter. Their story is not only about being first. History has many firsts, and not all of them remain alive in the imagination. The brothers endure because their achievement altered a fundamental human relationship. The relationship to the air, to movement, to distance, and to the limits of earthly travel. Before them, the sky remained largely an object of weather, symbol, religion, and longing. After them, it became a route. That transformation is civilizational. And yet, for all its vast consequences, the story remains marked by quiet qualities. The Wright brothers were not men of grand public drama by nature. Their greatness came clothed in restraint. They built patiently. They doubted where others proclaimed. They learned from failure. They guarded their work, refined it, defended it, and endured the burdens that followed success. Even their greatest moment came without spectacle, on a cold December morning before only a few witnesses. This quietness is part of their legacy too. It reminds us that world-changing events are not always born in noise. Sometimes they emerge from long discipline, exact thought, and the refusal to abandon a problem that has not yet yielded its answer. So the conclusion of their story reaches in two directions at once. It looks back to the brothers themselves, to Wilbur's brief and consequential life and Orville's long guardianship of their shared achievement, and it looks outward to the century they helped create. A century in which flight reshaped war, trade, science, travel, and imagination. By the time Orville died in 1948, the world they had entered as young men scarcely existed in recognizable form. America had industrialized, empires had risen and fallen, 2 world wars had redrawn the globe, and the airplane had become one of the defining instruments of modern civilization. Through all of that, the first flight remained a point of origin. In the end, the Wright brothers left more than an invention. They left a method, an example, and a changed world. They showed how disciplined curiosity can turn a dream into an engineering problem, and then turn that problem into a reality that transforms human life. Their names endure not because history is sentimental about pioneers, but because the sky itself was made newly human by what they did. From the dunes of North Carolina to the air routes of the world, from a toy helicopter in childhood to the global age of flight, their story forms one of the clearest lines by which modernity can be understood. It begins quietly, in a changing America with 2 brothers learning how to think. It ends with the world in motion above the earth, carrying forward the consequences of their work.